Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Disclosure Project. Tonight, we find ourselves flying over Antarctica in 1947 beside Admiral Richard Byrd. The aircraft is a Douglas R 4D-5L, its twin radial engines drumming against the frozen silence. The fuselage rattles in the cold, skis bolted beneath the frame in case of emergency landing on the ice. Outside, the white desert stretches endlessly, a blinding sheet of snow and sky with no horizon to tell them apart. Inside the cockpit, breath fogs in the air, frost crawls along the glass, and then, suddenly, the compass needle begins to spin madly. A faint warmth begins to flow through the cabin, unnatural, like the ghost of summer pressing against your face. Heat where only ice should be. Officially, Operation Highjump was nothing more than a training exercise, yet it carried thousands of men, 13 ships, even aircraft carriers into the most desolate place on Earth. So why did it end abruptly after just weeks? Some say bad weather forced the withdrawal, others whisper something else, something Byrd may have recorded in his hidden diary. But before we begin, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy, and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button goes a long way to keep these journeys coming. Now, join me in Antarctica as we retrace the flight paths, the records, and the whispers that never made it into history books. Keep one eye on the official reports, and another on the shadows between them, because Byrd's journey may have pointed towards something governments weren't ready for us to see. Imagine calling something a scientific expedition when it looks, from the outside, less like a research trip and more like an armed deployment. In 1947, 13 US naval ships set course for Antarctica with thousands of men on board, including an aircraft carrier. The stated mission was called Operation Highjump. On paper, the purpose sounded reasonable, even admirable. Train personnel for polar survival, practice cold weather logistics, expand mapping of polar regions, and test equipment in sub-zero conditions. But when you step back and weigh those official goals against the size of the fleet, questions hang in the air. How much firepower is required just to measure glaciers and set up tents on the ice? What sort of science travels with destroyers and submarines? If you picture it for a moment, the sight of that convoy steaming through frigid waters, you sense something larger, something heavier than a routine scientific exercise. The presence of an aircraft carrier alone stands out. Carriers aren't useful for studying penguins or charting coastlines. They are built for projection of power far from home. Alongside it came destroyers, vessels armed with torpedoes and rapid-fire guns. One submarine reportedly joined as well, built not for hauling supplies but for stealth, surveillance, and conflict training. Icebreakers cut open passageways, while supply ships hauled fuel, spare parts, food, and gear. Altogether, the operation was nothing short of elaborate, a full task force deployed to the world's emptiest continent. For comparison, civilian scientific expeditions of the 1940s looked modest. Small teams, maybe one or two vessels, minimal armament, a short roster of scientists. Yet here the Armada carried numbers closer to wartime scale. Supporters of official explanations argue that this is simply what happens when the US Navy conducts a mission. Scale and redundancy ensure safety. But the sight of cruisers and heavy aviation assets encircling an island of ice was enough to spark rumours that some shadow purpose lay behind it. You're standing in the icy wind as the ships form their line. Behind the stated purpose of logistics training, you notice details that blur the line between scientific research and military show of force. Was Highjump meant to assert geopolitical claims in the south before potential rivals could plant their flags? Was it a chance to rehearse naval manoeuvres under extreme conditions? Or, as whispers later suggested, was the fleet preparing for contact with something unexpected at the edge of the known map? No single explanation satisfies all of these doubts, which left room for interpretation then, and still does now. Even before the mission ended, foreign observers paid close attention. South American newspapers reported on the extravagance of the American presence, questioning why such force was required if science was the priority. In Chile and Argentina, where territorial claims brushed against Antarctic waters, commentators speculated about hidden motives. Was the presence directed at rivals, at the environment itself, or at mysteries known only to insiders? The skepticism didn't vanish after the ships withdrew. It spread under the surface, feeding later theories about why Operation Highjump remains one of the most enigmatic trips in US naval history. Officially, the plan was supposed to last 6 months. Crews prepared supplies and equipment with that time frame in mind. Yet barely a few weeks after their arrival, the entire operation wound down and ships returned north. The given reason was simple. The weather had become too harsh, but Antarctic weather in summer has always been punishing, and that was already known in 1947. Ending months early raised eyebrows. Why absorb the expense of such a campaign only to collapse it almost at once? Inside the military, the answer may have been routine, equipment failures, resource challenges, or risk management. Outside, it looked peculiar. The sudden withdrawal was fuel, adding weight to the idea that something unspoken pushed them out. Take a moment to step back and picture the timing. This was not an era of relaxed budgets. World War II had been over for less than 2 years. Taxpayers were weary of military excursions, and resources were strained across multiple fronts. A fleet of this magnitude was expensive. So why commit to it, given the cost, if survival training or cartography was the main purpose? A far smaller crew using aircraft from South America could have mapped ice shelves. Smaller research teams had done so, with at least partial success before the war. The scale of Highjump went beyond what was necessary for its stated objectives, and that mismatch continues to attract speculation. For those on the ships, the experience was more complex than the official statements. Men trained under brutal cold, practiced setting up camps and tested vehicles on ice. Planes flew low over barren expanses, cameras clicking through frozen clouds. But then, amid this anticipation of months of work, came the sudden order to wrap it all up. Cargo restowed, rations redistributed, an entire fleet turning back after barely scratching the edge of the continent. To the outside, it looked like wasted effort. To insiders, it was classified as success. Training completed, equipment tested, lessons logged. Yet the difference between public expectation and briefing room assessment left a gap into which rumour naturally poured. Those rumours range from the mundane to the extravagant. Some thought the show of force was just that, a display to remind other powers, particularly the Soviet Union, that the US Navy could reach anywhere, even Antarctica. Others speculated that the early withdrawal masked mechanical disasters, aircraft losses, or budgetary overreach. But supporters of less conventional interpretations pointed to scattered reports of strange sightings, sudden equipment failures, odd atmospheric conditions, and even unusual aerial phenomena. Official records do not confirm such tales, but the silences are where imaginations thrive. You're in port in South America as the fleet steams back earlier than planned. Dockside newspapers run headlines hinting at US ambitions in the Southern Hemisphere. Locals wonder whether America seeks control of rumoured resources beneath the Antarctic terrain. Coal, uranium, or oil. These suspicions mesh with a century of explorers speaking of hidden valleys, unusual warmth, and geological oddities under the ice. In this climate of speculation, every absence of detail operated like an echo chamber. The more the Navy avoided commenting, the louder the alternative theories rang. When critics compare Operation Highjump to other expeditions of its day, the contrast is stark. A traditional scientific team sends a single icebreaker and perhaps one support vessel. Budgets are tight, objectives limited. Discoveries might be small, new samples, new mapping data, maybe the sight of animals little known. Highjump, by contrast, resembled a battle group preparing for a campaign. Imagine lining up destroyers against the silence of the southern sea, a submarine gliding beneath, guns cleaned daily though not expected to fire. That image collides uneasily with the official story of conducting meteorological readings and survival training. None of this proves sinister intent, but when the size of the mission is measured against its short timeline, the contradiction refuses to resolve. Did the Navy seriously misjudge conditions, or was the intended task completed more quickly than outsiders were told? Supporting evidence to close these questions is scarce, which leaves us with ambiguity. Too much fleet, not enough time, an early return, and a swirl of unanswered suspicion. This combination proved irresistible not just to conspiracy-minded observers decades later, but to ordinary citizens watching in 1947 who wondered why their newspapers carried one story while whispers told another. The true shape of Highjump remains difficult to pin down. Certainly it helped train crews for polar logistics, and records show that mapping data was collected. But history books rarely linger on the early withdrawal, nor do they pause to emphasize how militarized this mission appeared. The absence of such detail in mainstream accounts is partly what fuels later theories. The very silence is its own evidence, interpreted by many as an intentional omission. So you're left staring at a paradox, a fleet that dwarfed the need for science, a mission that ended before its schedule, and a set of official goals too modest to seem plausible compared with the intensity of the deployment. South American observers were among the first to voice that contradiction out loud, but they were hardly the last. The suspicion endures because the puzzle endures. Why Antarctica? Why then? And why with such overwhelming force? In the end, Highjump's official goals can be accepted on paper, but the sheer magnitude of the operation will always suggest something more. Even if all scientific tasks were completed, the sense of over-preparation and the abrupt exit keep the story unsteady. A 6-month plan executed in mere weeks implies a hidden urgency, or at least a hidden miscalculation. You may accept the official reason of bad weather, or you may keep wondering. Either way, the unanswered questions cement Highjump as more than a footnote in naval history. It becomes instead an invitation, an unresolved passage in the story of exploration, secrecy, and speculation. And it is this very uncertainty that leads us onward. Because if the size of the fleet left outsiders scratching their heads, what came next in Admiral Byrd's personal accounts would unsettle even those within the mission itself. You sit in the cockpit, the glass canopy rattling with the low growl of the engines, and right beside you, Admiral Byrd leans toward the compass. The needle should be steady, pointing north as it always had, but instead it spins without pattern, whirling aimlessly as though the very ground has abandoned magnetic law. At first you think it's a mechanical issue, maybe frost inside the casing or a loose wire in the panel, but no matter how long you watch, the needle refuses to behave. The more Byrd turns the dials, the more erratic it becomes. Out in front of the nose there is only endless white, broken by shadows of ridges and cliffs, yet the instruments act as if the aircraft is flying over a different world. For seasoned aviators who rely on these small pieces of steel for their very lives, this sudden betrayal would feel like walking across a floor that turns to water under each step. Navigational anomalies near the poles were not unheard of. Early explorers had spoken of compasses that pulled in strange directions, needles that twitched wildly when ships crept too close to those icy latitudes. The phenomenon could be explained by the planet's magnetic field, which bends dramatically at the poles and often fools instruments designed for calmer magnetic flows. But here, in 1947, with carefully calibrated instrumentation and the might of the US Navy behind them, the same problem struck with unnerving intensity. Imagine being told your equipment was the most advanced available, only to see it act with the same confusion recorded by weary sailors a century earlier. The juxtaposition of cutting-edge military technology against a centuries-old problem only deepened the unease. Was this simply the inevitable effect of magnetic irregularity, or was something else at work beneath the ice? As the compass twists itself into chaos, seasoned sailors and pilots suddenly find themselves stripped of their confidence. Training cannot prepare you for the moment when your unshakable tools turn against you. Every bearing becomes uncertain. Every planned course looks fragile. You're navigating blind across a landscape that offers no landmarks, no trees, no cities, only an infinity of white that repeats until your senses lose track of scale. To these men, whose lives are dependent on precision, this failing was as much psychological as physical. Hours above the ice could stretch into long battles with paranoia. Had they flown too far? Were they circling the same mountains again and again? If the instruments were wrong, the entire mission could fracture at the seams. For all the manpower and ships below, each crew in the air was alone within a storm of doubt. But as strange as the compass was, the whispers claimed the environment itself betrayed expectations. Accounts, always disputed, often second-hand, described sudden patches of warmth. Pilots said they felt drafts of wind that weren't cold at all but carried the bite of spring. Others swore they glimpsed what looked like greenery, valleys of bare earth, and possible vegetation breaking through what should have been unending frost. In theory, such anomalies could be explained by geothermal activity. Parts of Antarctica do hide valleys warmed by underground heat, though rarely seen from above. Yet to men who had flown for hours across nothing but white ice sheets, the shock of sighting bare ground or a trickle of open water left them more unsettled than reassured. In their eyes, something didn't add up. A barren continent is one thing. A continent hiding pockets of possible warmth and life is another. And once you've doubted what the compass tells you, can you believe what your eyes show you through the glare? The atmosphere in the cockpit would have been a mixture of calculated calm and private fear. Byrd himself had been to the frozen south before, leading expeditions in earlier decades. He was no stranger to the ice, no gullible amateur easily spooked by rumours. Yet even he watched the needles spinning with attention, sharp enough to leave an impression on those around him. You can picture his brows low, his hands steady on the throttle, speaking clipped instructions while inside his mind questions grew. Was this another instance of magnetic mischief that could later be written off in reports? Or did it mark their entrance into a region less understood, a place where natural law showed seams and weaknesses? Every man watching him would have been tense, relying on his steadiness to keep their nerves from unravelling. It wasn't just the men in the air who felt strangeness. Those on the ships below heard the reports filtering through radios. Mixed messages crossed channels. Some pilots complained of bearings that no longer aligned. Others mentioned turbulence in clear skies. A few hinted at landscapes that didn't match maps. These were fragments, half overheard, never spelled out in official logs with the detail we might want. Yet in their absence of clarity, a shadow formed. People began to say there was more happening above the ice than routine flights. Later decades would seize on those fragments, weaving them with rumour until the compass spinning became almost a symbol, proof that something had thrown order into chaos, that this was the first sign of crossing into a hidden territory. Critics point out, of course, that polar anomalies are ordinary, but for those who experienced it, the line between scientific explanation and uncanny disruption blurred. It wasn't until later that foreign newspapers picked up Byrd's words and made them stranger still. Counts appeared in Chile suggesting he had warned of unidentified craft capable of sweeping from pole to pole at alarming speeds. Whether he truly said these words exactly remains debated, but the reporting gave a sense of unease. Imagine reading that in Santiago or Valparaiso, far from the ice but close enough to feel pulled into the tail. To South American readers, it suggested not just navigational confusion but technological mystery. Craft able to leap the planet in hours? The compass issue suddenly looked like a symptom, not an isolated inconvenience. Even if these reports distorted reality, The fact that they reached the public shows how quickly unease spread beyond the mission itself. The phenomenon of a spinning compass became tied, perhaps unfairly, to the idea of machines unknown to ordinary military arsenals, so the sense of trust falters. You are a pilot in that moment, your senses battling against what your panel tells you. If the compass cannot give you north, then your mind begins to question the horizon too. Perhaps that mountain isn't where you think it is. That valley may be closer or farther. The gauges betray you, and then your memory betrays you. Pilots in fragile planes above the coldest place on Earth depended on certainty. Fuel ranges, bearings, altitude. Strip that certainty away, and every second stretches into unease. The entire mission hangs by a thread of assumption that someone, somewhere, still knows which way the aircraft is heading. Without trust in instruments, trust in command decays. Without trust in command, the men's confidence disintegrates. This was more than a compass problem. It was the first ripple across the fabric of their mission. That ripple, supporters say, widened into something vast. They argue the anomalies were more than magnetic drift. That Byrd's journals suggest a doorway, or at least a suggestion of passage, into a hidden part of the world. Whether or not you believe this, the compass deceiving the pilots became the crack in the story's surface. Official reports said Operation Highjump was a success. Records list flight hours, mapping achievements, survival experience gathered. Yet behind all of that, murmurs grew of an incident never admitted. For those who lean towards speculation, this compass episode marked the point where fact turned into mystery. For critics, it was just the Earth reminding men of human limits, stripping away the illusion of mastery in one of the harshest places on the planet. What can't be doubted is this: those who flew that day remembered the compass refusing to behave. Whether the cause was physical law or something stranger, the effect was the same: a permanent seed of uncertainty. For Byrd's story, uncertainty mattered more than proof. It became the fuel for conjecture, the whispered point of divergence from routine expedition into shadowed legend. If you want to find the origin of all later claims, the diaries, the voices of advanced beings, the talk of inner worlds, it begins with trust lost in whirling steel. Once the compass spins, reality spins with it. And that is why, decades later, people still speak of the moment as if crossing an invisible border. Because the compass episode doesn't stand alone. It connects almost directly to what many later called Byrd's Forbidden Diary, a set of writings that, authentic or forged, expand the mystery far beyond mere technical glitches. If a compass can betray you, perhaps a diary can too. But if either one contains more than they seem, then Highjump was not just another mission. It was something else entirely, a story of the ice-hiding truths we were never meant to hear, and the first whisper of that truth came as Byrd stared down at a needle that refused to obey. But the compass wasn't the only instrument that seemed to turn against him. In the cockpit, surrounded by the thrum of engines and the endless glare of ice, another intrusion crept in. This one not of needles and bearings, but of sound. Before the diary, before the whispers of lost pages, there was a different kind of whisper, a voice carried not in ink, but in static. The compass spins, but in the cockpit another sound cuts through the hum of engines. A hiss, a murmur, the kind of sound that slips under your skin, not loud, not even distinct, but persistent. You tilt the dial on the shortwave receiver and suddenly Antarctica isn't just ice and wind. It's a sea of voices that don't belong here. High-frequency radios were a lifeline in 1947. They kept planes in contact with ships, crews in touch with one another, even commanders tethered to the wider world. But at the poles, the ionosphere bends those signals, distorts them, folds them back onto themselves. You hear fragments where no station should exist, words that arrive in a language you don't speak, a weather forecast from half a planet away. The air is thin, the cold absolute, yet the sky feels crowded. bursts of static rise and fall like waves, crackling against the cockpit glass as if the world itself is speaking, and in that static something half-formed presses close. A clipped word, a pause that suggests intention, a voice flattened until it's neither human nor mechanical, just a pattern too deliberate to ignore. You picture the operator seated across from you, his gloved hand resting on the tuning knob. He leans in. He doesn't say it aloud, but you see it in his posture. Did you hear that too? The mystery of polar radio is real. Scientists describe it as ionospheric refraction, the charged shell above the planet bending waves in ways that turn distances inside out. But the men who flew here didn't describe it as science. They described it as the sky whispering. Numbers where no station broadcast them. Music without a source. Entire transmissions that arrived hours before they were scheduled. Some claim the signals belonged to Soviet trawlers far out to sea. Others called them ghost reflections of their own voices, warped beyond recognition. A few said nothing at all, because the less you admitted to hearing, the less anyone could question whether you had lost your mind. And yet, the logbooks show notations, unexplained bursts, voices recorded, entire minutes marked interference. A gentle word for something that, in the cockpit, felt deliberate. Imagine the sound itself. A background hiss, constant like a low breath. Then a rising pitch, almost a tone, thin as glass, sliding upward until it fractures into shards of noise. After that, silence. Silence so heavy you think your receiver has died. And then, 2 syllables, too fast to grasp, too warped to place. They pass through you before you can hold them, leaving only the memory that something tried to speak. You glance out the cockpit window, nothing but white horizons and the shadow of your own wing crawling across the ice. You look back at the radio. The hiss resumes. In the log you could write, interference noted. In your bones you carry something else, the feeling that Antarctica is not empty, not voiceless. That beneath the hush of the desert, a murmur persists. Later, back aboard ship, the stories circulate in mess halls and narrow passageways. Someone swears they heard a string of numbers, spoken too clearly to be chants. Another insists a song threaded through the static, faint but undeniable, a melody like an old lullaby. The officers dismiss it as auroral flutter, propagation quirks, tricks of tired ears. But the men don't forget, because it isn't just one flight. It happens again and again. Different crews, different frequencies. Always the same impression. A transmission without a sender, a voice without a mouth. And there is something about Antarctica that makes the whispers feel more credible. In a desert of ice where the landscape itself feels alien, the ear grows hungry for any sign of presence. A gull, a crack, a voice. It doesn't take much for the mind to bend ordinary noise into something intentional. Yet even skeptics admit, sometimes the transmissions carried structure, patterns, repetition, the hallmarks of design. Science tells you the polar regions bend reality through physics. Radio operators call it skip. A signal bounces between Earth and ionosphere, leaping thousands of miles. What should vanish in static reappears in a place it should never be. But legends begin in exactly that space, when explanation exists but the experience refuses to shrink down into it. Supporters whisper that Byrd's logs once contained more than compass notes, that scribbled between headings and altitudes were fragments of transmissions, odd phrases, unexplained bursts. If those notations existed, they never made it into the declassified archives. Critics argue they were never there at all, that the myth of the polar whisper grew from sailors' imaginations. But think of it this way. Operation Highjump was already extraordinary. A vast fleet, aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, all deployed to a continent of ice. Add to that the natural distortion of polar radio, and you have the perfect seedbed for stories. Even a whisper can grow into a legend when planted in Antarctic silence. Picture one night in particular. The R4D sits on the ice, engines cooling, skis biting into snow. The cockpit is dark except for the glow of the radio dial. Outside, wind moves in long, unbroken currents, moaning against the fuselage. Inside, the hiss fades, replaced by a steady pulse, one beat every second. Not thunder, not static, something mechanical, intentional, a pulse like a heart. You lean closer. The pulse stutters, and in the break, a syllable sneaks through. Not clear enough to record, but clear enough that you and the man beside you both look up, eyes wide, breath caught. You don't ask him what he heard. He doesn't ask you. But the silence afterward feels too heavy to be chance. This is how stories are born, not from certainty, but from the spaces between. Back in the United States, after the expedition ended abruptly, the murmurs followed Byrd. When he gave interviews, when he spoke at press conferences, there was always a sense of restraint, as if his words had to walk carefully around subjects that were not for public ears. Supporters point to his statements about craft that could fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. Critics counter that newspapers misquoted him, twisted offhand remarks into something sensational, but the whispers of Antarctica did not stop at the expedition's end. Amateur operators decades later still reported oddities on the bands, signals that looped endlessly, repeating phrases, distorted voices that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The lore of polar radio kept growing, fed by every unexplained burst and every missing explanation. There is a phrase sailors used. The ice talks back. They meant the creak of glaciers, the boom of calving cliffs, the way sound carries across frozen air. But in the cockpit of Byrd's plane, the phrase takes on another meaning. The ice does not just echo, it speaks, through radio waves, through interference, through fragments that refuse to resolve into nothing. You never know whether what you're hearing is real. You only know that you heard it. And in a place where the compass spins and warmth leaks into a frozen sky, doubt itself becomes part of the mystery. And so you're left with the image. Admiral Byrd seated in the cockpit of the R4D, his gloved hand resting near the receiver. The engines thrum. The horizon stretches white in every direction. The compass wavers, and beneath it all, a murmur, part static, part voice, part imagination, that will never be proven or disproven. Was it Soviet? Was it atmospheric? Was it the human mind insisting on company where there was none? Or was it something else? Something not meant for open airwaves? The answer never arrived. Only the hiss remains. The hiss stays with you long after the engines fall silent. It lingers in your ears when you lie in your bunk, in the quiet hours when even the ship itself seems to hold its breath. Some men will dismiss it as static. Others will swear they heard words. But Byrd carried the memory differently. Because when he returned from the ice, the murmur did not end. It deepened. On paper, his official reports speak of weather and logistics. In the margins, though, supporters say he wrote something else, not for newspapers, not for Navy files. Something kept apart, as if the truth could only be spoken in a diary never meant for open eyes. And so the radio's whisper fades into paper's silence. You turn the page and suddenly you're inside the lines of what some call Admiral Byrd's hidden record. Entries that point not to static or shadows, but to landscapes and beings no ordinary flight should have found. Imagine this. Years after Operation Highjump ends, a document appears claiming to be Admiral Byrd's private diary. Not the logbook he submitted to superiors, not the neat reports that filtered through military channels, but a personal record, supposedly hidden, supposedly censored. In it are not cold facts about ice and weather, but descriptions of landscapes that should not exist in Antarctica. Valleys warm with spring air, rivers running free, forests in a place known to be lifeless and sealed under ice. He writes of strange light, softer than the sun, and of beings so advanced they carried an aura of calm, as though their very presence shifted human anxiety into quiet curiosity. You picture this text in your hands, its words opening like a door to an impossible place, leaving you with the question, could a man as decorated as Byrd have invented this out of nothing? Byrd, after all, was not some fringe character scribbling in obscurity. He was an admiral with multiple distinguished service medals, a man whose career was built on discipline, duty and expedition. Yet this diary, if real, paints him as a witness to something that shatters the icy monotony of Antarctica. The lines describe mammoth-like creatures roaming green valleys, colossal animals thought extinct thousands of years ago surviving in a land hidden from the rest of the Earth. Byrd supposedly writes of advanced technology flying effortlessly, beings who radiate intelligence rather than menace, and the peculiar feeling of being welcomed rather than threatened. The language conveys awe, confusion, and even reverence. And for decades since, that mix of authority and mystery has powered debates over whether these words were his or someone else's. Supporters of the diary argue that its suppression is proof enough of its authenticity. They say Byrd himself was a respected voice, too credible for wild invention, which means his descriptions must have threatened the narrative established by governments during the fragile Cold War years. Critics, on the other hand, are adamant that the diary is nothing more than a forgery, published decades after Byrd's death, with no firm provenance. Copies vary in detail, language shifts between versions, and some stylistic elements don't match his confirmed writings. This isn't a small issue. If the formatting and phrasing aren't authentic, then what value does the document have beyond myth? And yet the debate doesn't fade, because people aren't really arguing over paragraphs of text. They're arguing over whether something larger lurks beneath Antarctica. Close your eyes for a moment and hear the diary's voice as supporters imagine it. One passage describes a valley that seems carved not by ice, but by the hand of time itself, warmed by unseen forces, where glaciers part as if driven back by a hidden sun. He's said to walk upon the ground with astonishment, seeing colours that don't belong in a world of white. Even the air feels different, less biting, more oxygen-rich, carrying the scent of vegetation. There are birds, not just penguins or skuas, but species foreign to the polar regions. And beyond that, enormous shapes move in the distance. They resemble giant mammoths, their fur long and matted, their size so great they cast shadows across the valley. To encounter such creatures in 1947 would be to look back in time, an evolutionary echo alive in an impossible refuge. The diary then supposedly shifts tone, describing encounters not with beasts but with intelligent beings, creatures luminous in appearance, communicating not in coarse language but directly, mind to mind. They are not framed as aggressors. They're calm, composed, even paternal, welcoming Byrd as a guest. They carry messages about humanity, about technology beyond our comprehension, about dangers in the surface world, dangers born of war, greed, and destructive ambition. This is where the mythic quality of the diary reaches its height. Supporters read these passages as truth hidden from the public to avoid social upheaval. Critics point out that the diary's ethical lectures resemble mid-20th century New Age writings more than the words of a naval officer. That mismatch fuels doubt, but it also raises the question, why would someone choose Byrd's name if not for the authority and weight it carries? If you pull back from the words themselves, you notice echoes that tie this alleged diary to a longer tradition of myth. Across cultures and centuries, stories emerge of inner realms accessible through hidden gateways. Tibetan traditions speak of Shambhala, a kingdom concealed within, where enlightened beings preserve wisdom from the outside world. Norse stories tell of lands beneath the surface, home to giants and guardians. Native American traditions speak of worlds under the earth where ancestors dwell in perpetual renewal. The alleged diary doesn't stand alone. It resonates with this chorus. It becomes one more account in a lineage of hidden worlds, tying modern exploration to legends from distant lands. Perhaps that resonance is why so many latch onto Byrd's supposed words, even when authenticity falters. The diary doesn't just describe Antarctica, it activates a mythological memory that human beings seem to carry globally. Still, when you examine the document critically, the problems leap out. There isn't one definitive diary. There are multiple circulating texts, each edited, translated, or published under different circumstances. No original manuscript confirmed to be written in Byrd's hand has surfaced. Versions differ on key phrases, some describing luminous beings in ambiguous terms, others expanding their messages into long moral warnings. This inconsistency is critical. If critics are right, then what we have is not a hidden report, but a myth manufactured and polished by later storytellers. It raises a question about the believers themselves. Are they truly defending Byrd, or defending the hope that his authority lends weight to a legend deeper than him? The reliability of the diary is weak, but the desire to believe in its message is strong. That is why the controversy refuses to die. Now consider the man himself. Why would a former polar hero fabricate landscapes of warmth and intelligent elders hidden beneath the ice? What would he gain? Byrd's legacy was secure. He had medals, respect, and a reputation untarnished by wild claims. Supporters point to this as evidence. A decorated admiral has no reason to waste his credibility on fantasy. Critics counter that he had no involvement at all, that the diary is a later invention attached to his name only to amplify its reach. In either case, the magic of the tale doesn't vanish. Instead, it shifts focus from whether he wrote it to why people need him to have written it. Perhaps the diary's importance lies less in authorship, and more in the hunger for stories that break the dull monotony of official history. You stand in front of this contested document, still unsure whether it is revelation or forgery. What you cannot ignore is how it changes the shape of Operation Highjump. Without it, the mission seems peculiar but explainable. A large fleet, difficult conditions, and early withdrawal. Add the diary, and suddenly the expedition points toward concealed worlds and encounters outside every known chart. With or without authenticity, it magnifies the mystery. It shifts Operation Highjump from a chapter in logistics training to a mythic junction, where mainstream history and speculative legend collide. The diary becomes less a source of evidence and more a hinge between two competing realities. And that hinge is powerful enough to turn a story of snow and ships into one of hidden civilizations, ancient knowledge, and secret messages entrusted to a man in uniform. It's worth noting that similar documents have circulated in other contexts. In the 19th century, explorers returning from remote regions occasionally published memoirs with embellished tales, lost tribes, strange lands, fantastical creatures. Most were eventually dismissed as exaggeration, products of imagination or salesmanship rather than field observation. The Byrd diary, if false, fits into this pattern. Yet what sets it apart is the timing. Post-war, in the shadow of nuclear weapons and growing Cold War tensions, people were primed to believe in hidden wisdom, in guardians watching over humanity, in technology so advanced it could steer societies toward peace or destruction. The atmosphere of that era made the alleged diary resonate differently than a 19th century explorer's yarn. In 1947, mystery wasn't a diversion. It was a lens through which people understood their precarious world. The diary, in whatever form it exists, may not give hard evidence of inner lands or luminous beings, but its impact is real. It provides a narrative framework that lets people connect compass anomalies, strange warmth beneath the ice, and abrupt withdrawal of a military fleet into a single line of mystery. Without it, these incidents may remain quirks of geology, logistics, and polar science. With it, they transform into an unfinished epic, a suggestion that our planet has secrets locked beneath the poles. Believing or doubting becomes less about the Admiral himself and more about which story of the 20th century you choose to see. One where Antarctica is a hostile desert of ice, or one where it conceals a vibrant, undiscovered world. In the end, the diary symbolises more than an artefact. It shows the fragile line between history and myth, between official records and whispered possibilities. It invites us to ask why certain documents surface decades after the fact, why they take on such authority when tied to prominent names, and why we are eager to find echoes of ancient legends within modern events. For some, it proves that governments covered up the most extraordinary discovery of the century. For others, it's just another folk story repackaged for a Cold War audience. Either way, it adds weight to the narrative of Operation Highjump by making the strange even stranger. And yet, as captivating as a secret diary may be, it is only one aspect of the larger puzzle. Because even if Byrd never wrote a word of it, the secrecy that followed Operation Highjump, the sudden end, the cryptic warnings, the silences in the official record, continued to magnify suspicion long after the planes and ships returned home. When the fleet returned home in early 1947, the official story was simple enough to print in every newspaper. Antarctica's weather had turned too harsh, so the operation ended early. Yet in interviews and stray comments, Admiral Byrd himself hinted at something more. He spoke about dangers that did not sound like storms or sub-zero temperatures. Decades later, those words would be twisted into warnings of forces unseen. To the men who served under him, silence became the dominant note of the debrief. An operation that had started with such bold publicity closed with clipped statements, stripped of detail, and hurried dismissals of inquiry. For those who expected long reports about ground covered and discoveries made, the abrupt ending felt jarringly incomplete. The official explanation pointed toward the weather. According to the Navy, the growing severity of conditions had made continued work impossible. Yet if you rewind the clock by only a few weeks, you find officers reassuring the press that months of operations still lay ahead. The sudden reversal raised eyebrows not simply because the weather worsened — after all, Antarctica was always dangerous — but because the shift from confidence to retreat happened so quickly. How did planners misjudge the season so badly? Why did the tone change from expected success to sudden departure almost overnight? You're left with announcements that hardly connect, and that gap between expectation and explanation became fertile ground for something far more intriguing. Years later, declassified records did reveal that Operation Highjump achieved some of its stated goals. Large stretches of Antarctica were photographed from the air, some mapping data was collected, and crews gained practical experience surviving in the punishing cold. These facts show the mission was not an empty gesture, but none of those pages in the archive explain the abrupt urgency of the withdrawal. The tone of those documents reads bureaucratic, professional, and clipped. Lists of sorties, maps outlined, check marks against objectives. What is absent is any clear justification for why a 6-month operation was halved. For many, that absence speaks louder than the bullet points of success. You can accept that logistics drove the decision, but you cannot avoid noticing that the reports glide over what caused the mission to compress so sharply. Whispers began to spread among those who had been there. Crewmen years later spoke of encounters that did not appear in the official papers. They described seeing unusual craft, circular, swift, and capable of manoeuvres no known aircraft could perform. Some stories place these discs emerging from the sea itself, rising with precision before vanishing into cloud. These testimonies were inconsistent, shared in fragments, sometimes only after decades of silence. Yet they added an element that no amount of official weather reports could counteract: the suggestion that the withdrawal was enforced not by conditions of ice and wind, but by something far stranger. Critics dismiss such stories as exaggerations, the inevitable folklore that attaches to any dramatic expedition. Supporters, however, insisted that these were clues of an extraordinary encounter quietly buried beneath the surface. Outside the United States, the story twisted still further. In Argentina, local newspapers reported that Admiral Byrd had warned of aerial capabilities that posed a threat to the United States. Different versions of the report circulated, some claiming he spoke of objects able to traverse poles at great speeds. Whether the quotes were accurate or coloured by editorial imagination, they spread quickly. Readers in Buenos Aires, Santiago and Montevideo encountered not articles about bad weather, but suggestive commentary about technologies unknown to ordinary nations. Whatever Byrd had actually said, the framing mattered. The foreign press broadcast an account laced with the possibility of danger, far different from the sanitised explanations printed back home, and that is where the contradictions emerge most sharply. For the Pentagon, Operation Highjump was presented as a partial success, hindered by nature. The debriefs were polished, technical, and carefully limited. They acknowledged logistical difficulties, but nothing beyond the realm of weather and terrain. Abroad, however, whispers suggested direct encounters with aerial anomalies. In the space between these narratives, speculation flourished. When men who had served began sharing recollections decades later, they only reinforced the sense that something remained unsaid. Some recalled equipment failing under unexpected electromagnetic interference. Others remembered conversations about sightings that were quickly brushed aside. None of these memories form part of the official archive, yet together they add weight to the sense of a missing piece. This absence of detail often fuels conspiracy more effectively than hard evidence ever could. When records neatly check boxes but leave out the questions that rest at the centre of the story, people fill the void themselves. You imagine being a sailor, returning home with fragments of a memory that you know will never appear in any textbook. You share it quietly with others over drinks, but the official world refuses to acknowledge it. In that contrast, between the authoritative silence and the personal recollection, the mythology of Highjump was born. Conspiracies do not require detailed testimony. They require the suspicion that truth has been withheld, and suspicion flourishes where gaps exist. For the historian, the challenge is this. The mission clearly achieved tasks that look ordinary. Training was completed, photos taken, survival lessons logged. But the early retreat, the ambiguous comments from Byrd, the later rumours of extraordinary encounters, these refuse to dissolve under the weight of official reports. They stand beside them as counterpoints, discordant notes in a piece of music that otherwise plays predictably. The competing accounts do not blend, but rather clash, leaving a space where interpretation itself becomes the only possible conclusion. You cannot reconcile the polished script with the scattered whispers, so you leave them in tension. That unresolved tension is what continues to attract attention decades later. Consider the optics of the time. A gigantic fleet leaves with fanfare, promising to plant a flag for months of training and exploration. Barely weeks later, it rushes back north, explaining nothing beyond bad conditions. The press notes it, foreign commentators speculate, and then the story closes. Yet if you take Byrd's hints seriously, that there were dangers beyond those of snow and ice, you're forced to consider what kind of threats could warrant such secrecy. Common weather risks were known long before 1947, and though accidents did occur, nothing explains the abrupt cessation of plans on such a scale. The sudden retreat thus reads like avoidance, whether from disaster, discovery, or contact with something not yet understood. In Argentina, Chile, and other nations neighbouring Antarctica, the fascination never faded. To them, the idea of a hidden presence beneath the ice carried geopolitical weight. If Byrd's fleet had seen technology unknown to modern nations, then perhaps Antarctica was not simply a frozen desert, but a place of strategic relevance. To this day, you can find echoes of those interpretations spread through articles, books, and speculative papers, all circling back to the sharp contrast between what was said in the United States and what was whispered abroad. The silence itself, some argue, was the statement, not what was written in debriefs, but what was not. And so, years later, the debrief of Operation Highjump stands as a polished shield. On its surface, science, training, and lessons in logistics. Beneath it, recollections of discs, rumours of dangers, and the gnawing suspicion that something was encountered but never admitted. The story refuses to collapse into neat categories. Instead, it sits half in sunlight and half in shadow. That is why every new student of Antarctica's mysteries eventually circles back to Byrd, to his mission, to his silence. It is all too easy to interpret the abrupt end as a deliberate act of suppression rather than an unfortunate result of climate. Silence does not erase suspicion, it cultivates it. Perhaps this was always inevitable. Even if nothing unusual occurred, the decision to gloss over abrupt reversals and the lack of detail in final reports guaranteed speculation. By under-explaining, officials allowed rumours to outgrow facts, and once outgrown, those rumours are nearly impossible to prune back. To this day, they stand taller than the ordinary achievements of the operation itself. If only the debrief had been rich in explanation, perhaps myths of disks and hidden valleys would have withered. Instead, by choosing silence, history took a different path. That choice of silence also explains why interpretations drift into mythological frameworks. If the simplest answers are stripped from the record, then people naturally import older stories into the vacuum. Echoes of Hollow Earth legends, ancient civilizations beneath surfaces, inner landscapes warmed by a hidden sun, become interpretive tools. If secrecy wrapped itself around Byrd's expedition, then perhaps myth offers the only language left to describe it. And so, the leap is made, from weather reports and naval checklists to secret diaries and subterranean realms. It may sound extravagant, but the bridge connecting these ideas is not evidence. It is silence, carefully maintained. This is why the debrief remains one of the decisive moments in the entire story. Not because it hides some tangible disclosure, but because it fails to settle the questions it raised. And in that vacuum, speculation thrives. The more carefully one studies what is missing, the more it suggests that something extraordinary required a mission. The debates about diaries, anomalous craft, and hidden valleys become possible only because the official record left them unexplained. In the end, it is not evidence but absence that drives fascination. From the vantage point of history, Operation Highjump is now inseparable from the stories told around it. However implausible those tales may appear, they gain strength not from fact, but from the way silence shaped them. You began with a fleet that seemed too large for its task. You saw a compass spinning without reason. You heard of a diary that describes impossible lands under the ice, and when the fleet returns, instead of clarity, you are offered silence. Silence that absorbs rumour like soil drinks water. And that silence opens the door to interpretation, to frameworks far older than the 20th century. Forgotten myths and cultural echoes now appear ready to fill the gap left behind by clipped debriefs and bland dispatches. For some, Byrd's silence suggested geography itself concealed worlds within worlds. For others, it looked like evidence of governments burying inconvenient truths. Either way, when an expedition carried on the greatest scale of its era ends with a vacuum of explanation, you cannot expect the imagination of the world to resist. And it is exactly into that vacuum that Hollow Earth lore comes rushing. But myths were not the only things rushing to fill that vacuum. The silence extended beyond voices and dispatches, reaching even into the very record meant to preserve the mission. Because Operation Highjump was not just measured in ships and men, it was measured in film. And in those reels too, the gaps became impossible to ignore. The doors of the debrief room closed, and the words spoken there never left. But secrecy did not only live in voices, it lived in images. Frames that should exist but don't. Reels once rattling in tins that no archive can account for. Operation Highjump was not just ships and planes, it was cameras. Dozens of them. Mounted under wings, strapped to cockpits, cradled by men in thick gloves. Every glacier was filmed, every landing documented, every briefing photographed. Entire film units sailed with the fleet, charged with making the Antarctic legible to audiences back home. Yet when the expedition returned, What the public received felt strangely thin. Smiling crews, ships steaming through pack ice, routine flights across endless white. Ordinary images, so ordinary they could have been cut from a training film. The sheer scale of the fleet, aircraft carriers, destroyers, thousands of men seemed blurred, reduced into postcards. What was missing was not what you saw, but what you expected to see. Consider the life of a reel in 1947. The lens opens, silver halides drink in light, the strip rattles forward. Later, a gloved hand notes the scene on a manifest. The canister loaded into a crate. A plane lands, reels are offloaded, stacked in the ship's belly, then ferried to a processing lab. There, chemicals wash through the emulsion, images bloom into being, and a projector throws them against a white screen. Between camera and audience lies a gauntlet of decisions. At each step, a chance for frames to vanish. Supporters of the Byrd mysteries whisper that certain reels never survive the gauntlet. That footage of anomalies, of objects, of encounters was quietly pulled aside. Critics argue the opposite. Duplication was selective, film too costly, and snow too monotonous. Why duplicate endless horizons when the story could be told in a handful of smiling faces? But that explanation carries its own problem. Vast stocks of film were spent, entire crews dedicated, countless hours invested. Yet the surviving record reduces an armada to a travelogue. Imagine being one of the editors. You sit in a dim room, strips of film spooling through your hands, the projector's hum filling the air. On the wall, a destroyer's deck glistening with frost. Cut. A mess hall of sailors laughing over trays. Cut. A plane's shadow gliding across the ice. Cut. And then a shot that doesn't fit. The horizon curves wrong. A light wavers where no light should be. The camera jerks as if the operator reacted too suddenly. You hold on that frame a moment longer. You mark it in pencil. You set it aside. Later, when the final reels are assembled, that marked shot is gone. To the public, the story is smiles, frost, discipline. The anomaly never existed. There is something haunting about missing film. A hole in an archive does not feel neutral. It feels deliberate, even when it might be nothing more than accident. Humans don't tolerate blanks well. We fill them. A missing page suggests erasure. A missing reel suggests removal. And Highjump carried more blanks than most. Dozens of flights filmed, but only fragments survive. Hours of footage logged, but only minutes remain. The largest polar mission in history, yet its visual record shrinks into a handful of safe images. 1947 sharpened the suspicion. The year of Roswell, of contradictions in headlines, of official statements retracting themselves within a day. Against that backdrop, missing reels looked less like clerical accidents and more like a pattern of omission. The sailors noticed. They joked in low voices. "You'll never see that reel again," one muttered as crates disappeared below deck. Another tapped his temple and said, "That's why you keep a copy in here." Memory became the only archive no officer could confiscate, and stories spread, as they always do. Men swore reels were lifted before reaching processing. Others claimed film showed discs rising from the water, valleys greener than they should be, lights moving against Antarctic sky. None of these claims can be proven, none can be disproven either, because the absence itself, the gap, has gravity. Film has its own way of aging. Left untouched, reels grow brittle, colours fade, faces shimmer in scratches and flickers. Even the most ordinary footage can begin to look uncanny. Valleys appear alive, skies seem unsettled. Now imagine reels locked away, never screened, never copied. Their stories frozen in darkness. When someone whispers that such canisters exist, you can almost hear them rattling in a vault, just slightly heavier, as if carrying more than light on celluloid. What gives the mystery endurance is not certainty of what was filmed, it is certainty of what was lost. A fragment here, a clip there, entire reels unaccounted for. The record admits how much was shot, yet the archive contracts. The gaps echo louder than the images themselves. Later generations stumble across scraps, a reel mislabeled in a museum, a clip resurfacing in a documentary with its context stripped. Each time, the find reignites speculation. Why this fragment? And why now? And what of the rest? Reels whispered about but never seen. Supporters argue the best footage was buried. Critics argue nothing unusual ever existed. But both concede the record is incomplete, and incompleteness itself can feel like intention. You are left with a single image, a tin dented from travel, its label smudged, resting in a darkened storeroom. Inside, frames no eye has seen in decades, perhaps only snow, perhaps more. The reel is never projected. It rattles faintly, a sound heavier than routine horizons could explain. And then the reel fades. The projector stops. The room grows dim. The story no longer lives on celluloid. It waits in the land itself. Where reels end, Antarctica begins. Where film goes blank, the continent whispers in warmth, in lakes, in valleys hidden beneath ice. What if beneath the lifeless ice, warmth has already been proven real? You picture Antarctica as a place of nothing but bitter wind, frozen oceans and landscapes so barren they seem closer to another planet than our own. And yet, tucked beneath that ice, there are places where heat rises from below and changes everything. You're not looking at science fiction here. You're looking at the strange, confirmed oddities of Antarctica itself. Right from the edge of the desert of snow, parts of this frozen continent refuse to conform, and when you hear about them together in the same breath as Admiral Byrd, the stories of hidden valleys and inner worlds feel just a shade harder to brush away. Let's begin with a location called the Bunga Hills. In 1947, not long after the era of Operation Highjump, a US Navy pilot reported something startling while surveying from the air. Instead of endless ice, he saw a pocket of exposed ground, an oasis in a land where no oasis should exist. The area stretched for dozens of miles, covered not with snow but rocky terrain, and spotted with lakes free of ice. For anyone who had ever seen only photographs of Antarctica's endless white, this was an anomaly that seemed almost unbelievable. Here, the surface defied expectations, and the photographs and later exploration proved it real. The Bunga Hills were not imagination. They exist, warm enough to push back the slow march of ice and create open waters where seals and seabirds gather, even inland. Now think about what that meant for the crews who'd been trained to believe in uniform hostility across the continent. Imagine flying low, cameras sweeping side to side, expecting glaciers only to see what looks like the shoreline of a northern summer lake. Pilots returning from those flights spoke of this shock as if the land itself had betrayed them. The idea that you could find a greenish tint of exposed earth in Antarctica was unsettling. If such features existed, what else could the ice conceal out of sight? And it wasn't only isolated hills. Deeper beneath the ice sheet, explorers have discovered immense subglacial lakes, entire bodies of water sealed beneath several kilometres of ice. The most famous of these, Lake Vostok, is roughly the size of Lake Ontario, buried under ice thicker than mountains. The water there has been isolated for millions of years, never touched by the surface world. But what makes it extraordinary is the warmth keeping it liquid. Trapped heat from below and the pressure of overlying ice combine to keep it from freezing. In that alien environment, researchers have found microbes that seem to have survived across millennia, adapting to conditions we thought impossible. When scientists draw watercores from these hidden reservoirs, they find traces of life. Not advanced life, not civilizations, but the simplest organisms, proof that isolation doesn't guarantee sterility. The microbes adapt to crushing pressure, no sunlight, chemical energy sources instead of the warmth of rays above. For conspiracy theorists, discoveries like these act as fuel. If microbes can survive untouched for millions of years, what about larger life? What about isolated ecosystems hidden in still unknown pockets beneath vast ranges of ice? While science stays measured, the mystery encourages leaps beyond the data. Then there are the geothermal anomalies. Antarctica lies over volcanically active zones, where underground heat seeps upward and produces sudden wells of warmth. These create giant cave systems large enough to walk through, warmed by volcanic heat, their walls dripping with condensation instead of frost. In some areas, scientists exploring vents have recorded temperatures above freezing, even in caverns that tunnel beneath the largest glaciers. The image of wandering through ice caves warmed from within feels too much like stepping into legend. It supplies a physical possibility for an idea long whispered, that sheltered pockets beneath the surface might hide more than a rock and water. To pilots of the mid-20th century, none of this had been charted in careful geological journals. To them, the unexpected glimpse of bare earth and unfrozen lakes was enough to spark awe. On-camera footage even showed what looked like pools of bluish water, patches where reflective ice did not dominate the frame. Stripped of scientific context, citizens seeing those photographs saw the impossible: warmth thriving in a land advertised as dead. Combined with stories of the spinning compass and the abrupt end of Operation Highjump, memories of green valleys slipped easily into the territory of myth. This is where you see the tension sharpen. On one side you have science, subglacial lakes, geothermal caves, exposed oases like the Bunga Hills, all supported by measurable data. On the other side you have speculation, where people imagine hidden civilizations flourishing beneath the ice, ancient refuges untouched by time. The evidence is real. The leap into legend rests on interpretation. It is the gap between photos of warm lakes and stories of luminous beings that keeps imaginations working overtime. Critics insist we must separate the two categories, but where human imagination is concerned, separation rarely lasts. It matters because scientific anomalies, while extraordinary in themselves, also carry narrative weight. Most of us assume Antarctica is uniform, white, hopelessly cold and absent of life. But when pilots see warmth, when cameras pick up land free of snow, when researchers describe stable biospheres underneath glaciers, that picture shifts. Even if you close the door on speculation, you are left with a continent full of contradictions, and contradictions are often enough to expand mysteries into myths. Once you hear that life endures beneath miles of ice, hearing about valleys and rivers in Byrd's alleged diary doesn't sound as ridiculous. It resonates. When the public in South America heard reports about Admiral Byrd hinting at strange things near the poles, these anomalies gave those reports weight. Newspapers that wrote of flying objects crossing pole to pole spoke into an atmosphere already brimful of wonder and odd discoveries. If Antarctica could hold warm valleys, who could dismiss out of hand the idea that it might also conceal other secrets? Different cultures bring their own echoes to the tale. In Siberia, rumours of underground realms have lived for centuries. In Tibet, myths of hidden kingdoms where advanced beings reside sound uncannily, like a narrative that the Byrd diary later seemed to suggest. A world where caves beneath Antarctica drip with warmth is the perfect stage upon which those echoes can be projected. Still, sober voices remain clear. None of these anomalies prove there are lost cities or inner suns. Science has found heat and microbial life, but not mammoths or guardians. To conflate the two is to wander into exaggeration. Yet it's impossible to deny how often exaggeration grows directly out of fact. Cities beneath the earth may be legend, but warm valleys on a frozen continent are reality, and the human mind doesn't often draw neat boundaries when presented with such strangeness. Take the example of Lake Vostok again. Researchers drilling cautiously into the sealed water body found microbial DNA and chemical traces that hint at an entire ecosystem. The scientific language is careful, Extremophils? Chemosynthetic organisms? Isolated biosphere? The speculative leap is less careful. If microbes endure there, perhaps larger beings survive too, hidden ever since prehistory. No scientist claims this, yet the idea lingers precisely because the groundwork of wonder is already in place. The caves warmed by volcanism present another hook. Some are said to stretch for miles, their interiors warm enough to support mosses and algae. Think about the symbolism of that. A continent known for killing nearly every explorer who touched it also contains caves where greenery lives hidden from view. For decades, this kind of discovery would have been enough to support rumour mills insisting that humans, perhaps ancient or advanced, might have found refuge there too. Nothing like that has been proven. But isolated fact can act like anchors onto which entire mythologies are built. So you stand at the edge of Antarctica's contradictions, a continent of ice, yet flecked with heat, a place of death, yet patterned with hidden patches where life endures. It is not a stretch to imagine how men already encountering compass failures and early retreat could add these features into their own haunting sense of strangeness. That was the soil in which conspiracy theories grew. You cannot dismiss them entirely, because without Bunga Hills, without subglacial lakes, without geothermal caves, the tales would feel baseless. It is precisely because the land is strange that myths find traction. The mini-payoff here is this. You don't need aliens or hidden civilizations to make Antarctica uncanny. Nature itself already does it. Warm valleys, mammoth-sized lakes sealed beneath ice, enormous caves heated by underground fire. They are enough. No need for luminous beings. The land by itself can haunt imagination. That's the part people sometimes miss. While nobody has found proof of lost cities, the documented science surrounding Antarctica's anomalies rattles the assumption that this is just another patch of ice at Earth's edge. Once that assumption is broken, people are ready to hear much more. And so the myths build. The compass spinning, the hidden diary, rumours of contact and the sudden retreat. They gain strength because the land itself offers real footholds for imagination. Antarctica doesn't behave as expected, and so the mind wanders toward explanations beyond expectation. The result is a continent that blurs fact and legend before you even begin to speculate. Strange lakes, hidden caves, oases in a frozen wasteland. Those are the facts. What people do with those facts is another story. And once that story takes shape, it begins to attach itself to other claims, other anomalies. Because if the land itself can appear unnatural, then eyewitness reports of discs rising from the water no longer sound like complete fantasy. This is how natural oddities amplify rumours. The unsettling terrain gives whispers a place to root themselves, and soon enough anomalies multiply, not in ice and rock this time, but in tales of craft and powers no human admits to owning. And that is where our path now leads. But Antarctica does not only feed imagination with rumours of the present. Beneath its ice lie records that stretch far deeper than any sailor's tale or pilot's sighting. Long before talk of discs and lights, the continent itself kept its own archive, etched not in diaries or dispatches but in stone. To move forward in the story, you must first step backward in time, into the strata where forests once grew, and rivers once ran across a land we now call barren. The lakes still steam in the mind long after the planes return to their carriers. The warmth is real, the valleys undeniable. But warmth suggests something more unsettling than geothermal quirk. Warmth is memory. It is the ghost of a continent that once lived in colour. You step backward in time, not by decades, but by millions of years. Imagine standing not on ice but under forest canopies, conifers reaching upward, ferns brushing your knees, rivers winding without freezing. Antarctica was not always white, it was once green. The evidence hides in stone. Petrified trunks, their rings recording summers and winters. Fossilized leaves pressed into shale. Imprints of ferns so crisp they look alive until your fingers graze the rock and find only ridges, each layer a clock face ticking backward, reminding us that the land we call desolate once carried abundance. Ice cores speak too, though in a different voice. Each drilled cylinder is a library of air. Tiny bubbles trap the breath of ancient skies. Carbon from forests, oxygen from oceans, volcanic ash from eruptions half a planet away. The deeper you drill, the further back you read, and the story the ice tells is one of change, warmth yielding to cold, green drowned by white, life pushed out until only silence remained. But the clock under Antarctica does not tick evenly. There are gaps, anomalies, jumps, layers compressed where they should spread, warmth appearing where none should be. Some scientists argue this is nothing unusual. Climate shifts, axis tilts, natural cycles. Others look at the record and whisper that something more complex lingers, that continents don't just freeze by chance. Sometimes they are forced into new roles, as if Earth itself resets a stage. You picture an explorer in the early 20th century, breaking open a rock expecting emptiness, only to find a leaf staring back. The fossil is delicate, veins clear, a map of water once flowing through a tree that no longer exists. For that man, the shock would not have been mythic, it would have been intimate. Proof that the land he nearly died crossing was once gentle, temperate, alive. That intimacy matters. Antarctica is not just alien, it is familiar. The fossils prove it. The continent remembers what forests felt like. It remembers rain. It remembers warmth. And that memory presses against the present whenever warm valleys or steaming lakes are found, as if the past refuses to remain buried. Some accounts describe fossils of reptiles, even dinosaurs, found near the edges of the continent. Others tell of pollen buried in sediments, proof that flowering plants once drifted here. Each discovery is not just a scientific curiosity, it is a reminder that Antarctica is a palimpsest, a manuscript written and rewritten. Today's ice is only the latest page. Beneath it lies draft after draft of Earth's history. Supporters of the Byrd Mysteries seize on this. If the continent once thrived, perhaps it hides more than ferns. Perhaps the warmth under the ice shelters remnants, not just of forests, but of structures. Critics insist this leap is too far, that fossils prove only natural history. But in the hush of Antarctic air, the boundary between natural and unnatural blurs. A fossilized leaf can feel like evidence, and evidence can feel like invitation. Think of the ice itself as a curtain, thick, white, heavy. Behind it, a stage. What actors once performed there? The fossil clock does not show us the actors. It shows us the stage, set for a play long past. But if a stage was once alive, can it not host new performances? Can it not hide props that refuse to decay? Geologists measure time in strata, millions of years compressed into meters of stone. But you, seated in the cockpit with Byrd, measure time differently. You feel it in the shift from frostbitten skin to sudden warmth, from barren horizon to steaming lake. Time collapses when the land contradicts itself. It is as though Antarctica insists it is both ancient and immediate, both memory and presence. The sailors may not have spoken of fossils, but they felt the weight of time anyway. To walk on ice kilometres thick is to walk across centuries stacked like glass plates. Beneath each step lies another age. Beneath each valley, another world. They may have joked about film reels disappearing, but the truer archive was always beneath their boots. And that archive is not silent. It mutters through anomalies. A warm current where there should be none. A valley green when everything else is white. A fossilized fern leaf pressed into stone like a bookmark reminding you that this chapter is not the first. Critics would insist this is romantic exaggeration. Fossils are data points, not whispers. Warm anomalies are geothermal vents, not ghosts. But stories grow where certainty falters, and Antarctica is certainty's enemy. The continent makes skeptics sound cautious, and believers sound bold, and both sound incomplete. Because whether you stand as scientist or storyteller, the fossils prove one thing beyond dispute. Antarctica has already been other than what it is. It has already transformed once, twice, more times than we can count. And if it has changed before, it can change again. You picture a fossil trunk petrified into stone. Rings circle inward, each one a season, each one a reminder that even here, life once counted years. You run your hand over its surface and realize that what you touch is both plant and rock, both history and relic. The tree grew in a forest, fell, was buried, became stone, was revealed again by human hands. It is an unbroken conversation between life and death, presence and absence. That is why some call fossils clocks. They don't measure hours, they measure permanence. They tell us how far back the story goes, and how quickly it can be erased. A single season can vanish under ice. A single continent can vanish under myth. And so Antarctica becomes more than a landmass. It becomes a reminder of fragility and endurance at once. The fossils whisper, life can bloom here. The ice counters, life can also end. Between them, you stand, listening to echoes of a world both gone and waiting. For Byrd and his men, warmth under ice might have felt like intrusion, like something alien pressing in. But from another perspective, it was simply memory resurfacing, the continent remembering itself. You step back into the present. The valleys remain, the lakes remain, the fossils remain. The fossil clock under the snow keeps ticking, reminding us that history is never final, only layered. Each discovery turns a page, but the book is never closed. And the question that lingers is not whether Antarctica was once alive. We know it was. The question is whether it still hides life of another kind, waiting beneath the curtain. The reels vanished into rumour, but the land itself keeps better records, and those records point to a past far stranger than official reports ever allowed. The reels may have vanished into rumour, but the land itself keeps better records. Stone remembers. Ice remembers. The fossil clock under the snow ticks on, whispering of forests, rivers and creatures long gone. Antarctica tells us plainly, what seems eternal can shift, what seems silent can hold entire histories beneath its hush. And if the continent carries such memories openly in its rocks and cores, how much heavier might the secrets be that men carried home in 1947? Not geological, but political. Not natural, but chosen. The fossils remind us that the world is layered. The year that followed proved that information can be too. Because as Byrd returned from the ice, the whisper of warm valleys and fossil forests was replaced by a different kind of warmth. The heat of secrecy, the friction of narratives polished down until only the smoothest surface was left for public eyes. 1947. The same year Admiral Byrd's fleet turned home from Antarctica, a strange story broke out of New Mexico. A crash outside the town of Roswell. At the very moment Highjump was still fresh in newspaper columns, reports of a flying disc ignited public imagination. Between them lay a thread that historians now frame as coincidence, but storytellers regard as something else. The year was already saturated with secrecy. New nuclear weapons brooded in the headlines, the Cold War simmered, and the idea of strange craft in the sky shifted from pulp magazines into mainstream worry. You're no longer in a world where explorers return only with sealskins and photos of snowy peaks. You are in a world terrified of technology, of shadows in the sky, of nations hiding truths. Picture life in 1947 for the average citizen. Only 2 years have passed since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Atomic imagery fills newspapers, mushroom clouds, test deserts, encampments measuring radiation. People talk about the bomb in tones of awe and dread. Against that backdrop, even a whisper of advanced technology, anything capable of speeds beyond known aircraft, has weight like a thunderclap. Governments know it too. secrecy becomes second nature. The press prints what officials allow, and silences appear in every record where details might unsettle people already shaken by the age of nuclear weapons. Enter Admiral Byrd. Emerging from Operation Highjump came interviews, some distorted, some ambiguous, where he hinted at dangers beyond the ice. In versions passed through South American newspapers, he's said to have warned of craft with the ability to travel rapidly from pole to pole, an unimaginable prospect in the early Cold War. The words sound cryptic, bordering on science fiction. But imagine hearing them in 1947, when supersonic flight was barely an idea and rockets still sputtered. The very hint of such speeds implied technology so far ahead it unsettled the fragile sense of superiority America had in the wake of the war. Now lay that beside Roswell. Newspapers first reported that the military had captured a flying disc. Hours later, the story was retracted. Officials clarified it was only a weather balloon. The retraction did little to stem curiosity. The seed was planted. Flying discs existed, said the small-town headlines. The government denied, said the following day's print. That sequence alone created an enduring suspicion, because once the public saw the claim, they couldn't unsee it. And here's where Byrd's alleged warning resonates. One moment he's linked with strange craft near the South Pole. Nearly the same year, Americans read of disc-shaped wreckage in the desert southwest. The parallel locked a sense of mystery onto 1947 itself. The Cold War atmosphere shaped these reactions. To leaders in Washington, Moscow and London, secrecy was not optional, it was armour. Admitting uncertainty risked panic. Panic in turn risked instability. The nuclear monopoly of the United States was already slipping. By 1949, the Soviet Union would detonate its own bomb. Any suggestion of unknown aerial powers could add chaos to fragile control. So when witnesses spoke of discs, or when an admiral made comments that could be interpreted as warnings, the default instinct was to contain, censor, or reshape the words. Better to muffle them quietly than to give rivals, or the public, more reasons to fear. For Byrd, the effect was peculiar. He was a decorated officer, trusted, admired, and thoroughly mainstream. Unlike fringe figures, he was not easy to dismiss. That made selective treatment of his statements all the more likely. Was he deliberately edited? Did his interview in South America get reframed to suit editorial agendas? Or did his own words wander close to something his superiors preferred unsaid? We cannot know, but the outcome is the same. His statements were ambiguous enough to be debated for decades, and scarce enough to feel like puzzle pieces withheld from plain sight. You can measure the tension by asking a simple question. What did governments fear more, curiosity or panic? The answer, in 1947, was panic. Citizens still adjusting to mushroom cloud nightmares were not ready to hear of technologies that made bombers look like toy planes. Leaders distrusted their own populations to handle mysteries without chaos. So silence was not merely a strategy against foreign powers, it was a strategy against their own people. Highjump's abrupt ending, Roswell's retracted report, both follow the same logic. If knowledge seems too destabilizing, let silence replace explanation. Consider how intelligence culture solidified in these years. Agencies grew that understood secrecy as a permanent state. The CIA was formed in 1947, the same year we are speaking of now. So, in the very season Byrd flew south and Roswell hit the headlines, a new architecture of hidden knowledge was being built. In that architecture, puzzle pieces like strange aerial sightings and expedition anomalies fit neatly, but only behind walls. To the historian, this is evidence of a climate, not a conspiracy. But to the storyteller, the correlation is glaring. A year when the gates of secrecy swung open and stayed that way. Was Byrd's testimony reshaped for strategic reasons or buried outright? Here lies the divide. Some argue his remarks were mistranslated or exaggerated, never intended as warnings of advanced craft. Others insist his words were deliberately smothered. their meaning too provocative to survive the filter of official narrative. Both views can coexist, strangely enough, because evidence is scarce. What matters is how the ambiguity itself fits into the fabric of 1947. It was a year when details were withheld, when words were trimmed, when explanation shifted overnight. Anyone trying to clarify was left with fragments, contradictions, and suspicion. Why suspicion? Because trust was dissolving. Citizens, already watching nuclear secrecy cloud the world, saw the same pattern repeat with flying discs and expeditions. They learned quickly that official lines could change day to day. First a disc, then a balloon. First a 6-month mission, then a sudden retreat. Each reversal left a bruise on credibility. Once trust weakens, alternative explanations rise like steam from cracks. If governments will not tell the full story, perhaps myths are closer to truth. In this way, secrecy itself created the soil for legends like Hollow Earth tales and tales of Antarctic beings. Think about the symmetry. In Roswell, a desert witness saw wreckage and secrecy eclipse the detail. In Antarctica, sailors or pilots whispered of anomalies, and silence ruled the debrief. Two far apart locations, both in 1947, both producing rumours stronger than facts. And in the centre of them both sits the same principle: state-directed secrecy to protect stability. Whether about disc-shaped wrecks or compass failures, the official approach was identical. File the report, redact the details, control the narrative. You can almost see history learning to protect itself. The chaos of World War II had just ended, but the habit of censorship remained. It wasn't only about hiding weakness from adversaries, it was also about preserving a fragile optimism in the population. Any suggestion of overwhelming forces, be they Soviet or something stranger, could unravel the sense of security governments fought to maintain. If silence achieved that stability, then silence became policy. And within that policy, men like Byrd could find their words reshaped, their experiences trimmed into safe fragments. For a moment, put yourself in Byrd's shoes. You return from Antarctica, where compasses spin, rumours of anomalies circulate, and your mission ends oddly early. You speak publicly in South America, perhaps offhand, perhaps pointed, about technological dangers. Hours later, your words are reframed or stripped of context. At the same time, people in the United States read headlines of a disk crash in Roswell, only to be told the next day it was nothing. If you connect the dots, you start to realise you live in a time when truth was not linear. It was adjustable, malleable, subject to whether leaders judge citizens ready to hear it. That's not a comforting realisation, and yet it was efficient. Silence and secrecy ensured stability in fragile years. People moved on, stories cooled, governments carried forward without explaining. For historians, this is frustrating. For storytellers, it is tantalising. Either way, the system worked. The absence of detail eliminated panic, and in the absence of panic, geopolitics continued on its trajectory into the Cold War. Rational or not, secrecy served the logic of the age. So when we look back, we find ourselves less surprised that Byrd's statements remain ambiguous than that they survived at all. The Cold War would consume countless testimonies, bury them beneath classification stamps and careful edits. Highjump and Roswell simply happened to collide in the same year, where their echoes reinforce one another. You begin to see why 1947 is more than a date. It is a climate of silence, where rumour stood in for fact, and myth became a parallel record to history. In short, Byrd's words, whatever they were shaped by an atmosphere where secrecy was as natural as breathing. Governments feared that curiosity could spiral into panic, so they trimmed statements, replaced uncertain details with safe ones, and classified anything too provocative. It fits the broader logic of an intelligence world that had just been born. What matters here is not whether his warning was authentic or exaggerated, but that the silence surrounding it made speculation inevitable, and that's the payoff. You see how Operation Highjump's mysteries don't stand alone. They sit within the larger culture of secrecy in 1947, the same year of Roswell, the CIA's founding, and the nuclear standoff accelerating. The consistency of silence shows you why conspiracies multiply. A cautious government plants the seeds by refusing to give more, but the silence doesn't end with intelligence culture. Because just as geology offered warm caves beneath ice, man-made secrecy offered fertile ground above it. Natural oddities collided with political caution, amplifying every rumour into legend. And those Antarctic anomalies, warm hills, strange lakes, magnetic anomalies, now carried even more weight, because they thrived in an age allergic to transparency. But secrecy isn't only a modern condition. Long before naval fleets and Cold War intelligence, Antarctica was already wrapped in distortions, not through dispatches or classified files, but through charts and maps, records that should have pinned the continent in place, yet instead shifted, contradicted, and sometimes showed what should not have been there at all. The year 1947 bent truth until it snapped. Headlines reversed themselves, reports tightened into silence, and the official record became more about erasure than revelation. But Antarctica had been playing this game far longer. Long before fleets steamed south, long before aircraft carriers cut through ice, the continent's story was told in ink on paper. And even there, it refused to stay fixed. You picture a map spread across a table, the parchment smells of linen and dust, the edges curled by age. At its centre lies a void. The known world surrounds it in careful detail. Rivers drawn like veins, coastlines shaded in meticulous strokes. But where Antarctica should be, there is nothing. A blank circle, an admission of ignorance dressed up as cartography. For centuries, maps carried this absence. Not an oversight, but a statement. Here be nothing, or here be dragons, or here be everything we cannot yet name. To see the world in those centuries was to live with an open wound at the bottom of the globe, an unfilled shape that seemed to swallow certainty. Some charts did more than leave blanks. They suggested outlines, coasts sketched where no ship had sailed, mountains traced with too much confidence. Critics call these accidents of imagination, cartographers extending coastlines to balance hemispheres, draftsmen mistaking icebergs for land. Supporters see something else, memory leaking forward, whispers of coastlines glimpsed long before they should have been. The most famous of these is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513, which some claim shows parts of Antarctica centuries before its official discovery. Mainstream scholars dismiss this. They say the map is a misinterpretation of South American coasts. Yet the argument persists because the image is too compelling. An icy continent drawn in an age of wooden caravels. But even if the claims stretch, the fact remains. Maps are never neutral. They are choices disguised as geography. To omit is as powerful as to inscribe, and Antarctica was always the test case, an expanse where omission reigned. By the time Byrd flew south, maps had improved, but only in increments. Expeditions traced shorelines, noted inlets, charted jagged coasts. Yet the interior remained stubborn, a white mass labelled with nothing but contour lines and guesses. The continent did not yield itself easily to ink. Instruments failed, compasses spun, horizons bent light into illusions. Cartographers filled the page with approximations, and those approximations hardened into fact until someone else replaced them. And that is the strange rhythm. Antarctica is mapped, and then unmapped over and over, valleys marked, later erased, lakes sketched, later doubted, whole mountain ranges appearing, then disappearing under correction. Each map is less a record than a wager, against a land that resists capture. You sit in a briefing room in 1947, a fresh chart unrolled. Red pencil marks the flight paths, black ink traces coastlines. The interior, still an emptiness. The officers lean over it, pressing rulers against paper, debating courses. They act as though the blankness is neutral, but every eye lingers there. Every mind wonders what could live in a space large enough to erase detail, It is not only sailors and admirals who felt it. The world outside noticed too. Newspapers reported discoveries one day, only to retract them the next. Claims of valleys, mountains, even open water circulated, then collapsed. The maps shifted like living things refusing to settle. Supporters of the Byrd legends insist this is no accident, that maps reveal what governments later denied. Critics counter that errors are common, corrections inevitable, and mystery a product of human impatience. Yet whichever side you lean toward, the sensation remains. Antarctica is a continent allergic to certainty. Think of how humans experience maps. A coastline drawn is a promise, a blank space is a dare. The eye fills in the missing. The imagination sketches forests into the void, builds cities along phantom rivers, raises civilizations from white space. That is how myths grow. Not from details present, but from details withheld. And Antarctica is the perfect myth engine because its maps never sit still. Even today, satellites redraw the ice year after year, showing shelves collapsing, valleys deepening, lakes shifting. The continent resists permanence. The ink never dries. In this light, Operation Highjump becomes more than a military exercise. It becomes another draft of a map, each flight path another line across the void, each photograph another stroke of ink. Yet what made it strange was not just the lines drawn, but the lines withheld. The public never saw the full map. The missing reels ensured that. And so, in a way, Antarctica remained what it had always been, a space half drawn, half withheld. Imagine a sailor spreading one of those maps on his bunk. He traces the coast with his finger, then stops at the blank interior. He does not see nothing, he sees possibility. Valleys steaming, craft rising, civilizations remembered only in myths. The map doesn't deny him this, it invites it. A blank is not emptiness. A blank is a stage. And in 1947, when secrecy tightened like a net, blanks on maps carried even heavier weight. They became symbols of what was not said, what was not shown, what lay hidden behind locked rooms and missing reels. Critics will always point to cartographic error. Supporters will always point to suppressed detail. But both admit the same thing. The maps misbehaved. They offered shapes that vanished, voids that expanded, lines that proved wrong, and in their refusal to settle they mirrored the very mystery that haunted Byrd's journey. You fold the map, tuck it under your arm and step into the cold. The wind off the ice has its own geometry, its own lines invisible to ink. You cannot map a murmur, a flicker, a silence. Yet these are what Antarctica gives most freely. And so you leave with a paradox. The more the continent is charted, the less certain it becomes. Each attempt to fix it only reveals how fluid it truly is. The maps that refuse to behave become part of the legend, as vital as diaries, as vital as reels. Because where the cartographer's ink ends, the mythographer's begins, and Antarctica has always invited both. The maps fold shut, their blanks unresolved, and in those blanks myths rush to fill the space. Shambhala, Agartha, a world inside the world. If the surface resists being charted, perhaps the answer lies below it, in caverns and hollows no pen could capture. Ancient stories have always whispered of places hidden beneath our feet. In some tellings, they are shining realms like Shambhala or Agartha, kept safe from the chaos of the surface. In others, they are fiery worlds, glowing with an inner light and cloaked from human eyes. You hear them in the monasteries of Tibet, in sagas told by Norse skalds, in legends carried by native nations across North America. They describe not an afterlife, but a physical place, an inner earth where beings wiser and older than ourselves dwell. These are not isolated myths. They appear scattered throughout the human record like clues half buried beneath our own lives. And when people heard Byrd's alleged words about lush valleys and luminous hosts concealed beyond the Antarctic ice, they instantly recognized the echo. In Tibet, elders spoke of hidden kingdoms, Agartha or Shambhala. places of refuge reachable only by chosen travellers. These realms were said to shine under an inner sun, their borders marked by energy fields and guarded passageways. Keepers of secret knowledge, they were thought to watch humanity from below, waiting until the surface world was ready. Even if the stories were allegorical, they inspired a vision. The Earth itself could house civilizations unknown to us. Norse traditions carried something parallel. In those sagas, the world beneath was a complex network of realms. Some were harsh, like the subterranean land of fire, Muspelheim. Others were lush, like the domains where giants and guardians traced long lineages older than men. The vision was not uniform, but the idea was. The Earth was more than rock. It was layered, alive, and deeper than maps could mark. The New World had its echoes too. Some Native American legends spoke of ancestors emerging from openings in the ground, vast caverns beneath mesas or cliffs that sheltered worlds where life began again after disaster above. These were not mythological heavens. They were geographies, anchors tied to place. Walk through certain deserts or mountains, tribes said, and you could feel the doorways vibrating beneath your feet. If you listen to these voices across continents, a strange chorus forms. They all describe a world within, sacred, luminous, and difficult for mortals to enter. Why so many cultures imagine a similar theme is its own question. Whether it reflects symbolic journeys inward, or half-remembered fragments of something lost. So ask yourself, how do people separated by geography and time all form traditions of hidden interiors? Was it simply a shared human metaphor for hidden wisdom, for the subconscious mind made literal? Or is it possible that these stories record something more? You glance back at Byrd. If the diary attributed to him carries even a sliver of authenticity, his words sound like modern chapters of this ancient story. His alleged entry describes valleys warm and fertile, an unexpected light filtering down, creatures long gone elsewhere, and beings described as luminous, intelligent, and strangely welcoming. He writes as if stepping not into an alien planet, but into a myth already told by generations elsewhere. In his account, the gate to Shambhala lies not in Tibet but beyond the Antarctic ice, flower-like and waiting. The motifs repeat themselves. In Tibetan lore, hidden lands glow with an inner radiance, warmed by a central source of power rather than the overhead sun. In Norse descriptions, hidden dominions nurture forces of wisdom or destruction beneath familiar geography. In Byrd's alleged version, he finds a valley that seems warmed by forces unseen, touched by a light without source. Whether described by monks, poets, or explorers, the script is strangely cohesive. Human beings describe protected lands hidden inside, watched over by advanced guardians who appear more teacher than predator. For some traditions it is spiritual allegory, for others it is semi-history. For Byrd's supporters, it becomes evidence that he entered a chapter of the same universal myth. Picture the scene as he allegedly tells it, a valley carved into the white, filled with warmth where ice should reign. His panels indicate atmospheric calm, the chill vanishes, and a soft radiation fills the aircraft. Before him appear beings unlike any he has seen, described as radiant, capable of communication not verbal, but mental. They act, by his handwriting, as stewards who speak to him about mankind's future, about destructive paths already visible in the atomic age. Whether the lines are fictional or authentic, their content mirrors ancient traditions almost too closely. What Shambhala was said to be in the east, his valley resembles in the south. Tibet's myths tell of leaders from Agartha who could guide humankind when the time was right. Norse myths describe watchers connected to forces beyond human reach, holding powers tied to cycles of destruction and renewal. Byrd's beings, calm and warning, fit the same pattern, the guardians. The message comes packaged differently, but the theme is the same, Wisdom inside, recklessness outside, a gulf that only select emissaries may cross. For those captivated by this story, Byrd is not inventing a fantasy during a flight. He is stumbling, uninvited, into the same myth told for centuries, opening a door thought to belong only in folk tradition. Still, science urges us to step back. Geology has no room for hollow worlds. The planet we inhabit is solid mantle, molten core, metal pressed at pressures so great they dwarf any city's strength. No cavity can stretch across thousands of miles with its own inner sun. Earth's structure has been charted by seismic waves, read by instruments that tremble when quakes strike. Every line of evidence points to density, not hollowness. Where Tibet or Norse myth describes underground sanctuaries, geology describes magma chambers, tectonic crust, and pressurized minerals. The two frames do not blend. Science dismisses hollow earth theory as impossible. Yet the point is not whether these stories survive the rigors of mineral physics. The point is why they endure anyway. If cultures across time describe hidden lands with inner suns, it may be less about geology than psychology. Myths reflect deep-seated human instincts. It could be that worlds within worlds always represented knowledge buried inside ourselves, not beneath landscapes. Byrd's diary, if constructed by later hands, fits the same human yearning. We want to believe the surface is not the whole of reality. We want the ground under us to carry secrets. And so myths offer interpretive lenses even when science says no. When people link Byrd's entries to Shambhala or Agartha, they are not proving geography. They are weaving interpretations, finding global echoes to validate a strange claim. For Byrd's supporters, the diary is evidence of consistent myth converging with historical record. For critics, it is proof only that myths are compelling enough to resurface in forgery. Either way, the existence of worldwide traditions strengthens the story. They provide context that makes the notion of inner realms harder to dismiss outright. Myths are not data, but they create frames of expectation. And into those frames, Byrd's words, even if dubious, fit seamlessly. Humans are pattern seekers. Tell them about a pilot who glimpsed green valleys beneath the Antarctic ice, and they will immediately connect it to what they already know: the secret kingdoms of Tibetan monks, the inner domains of the Norse, the emergence caves of native peoples. None of these can prove another, but together they form a row of mirrors. Each reflection reinforces the illusion until it feels less like invention and more like continuity. In this way, Byrd's diary, real or fake, lives inside a mesh of older voices. That is why it refuses to fade. It does not stand alone. It resonates. So perhaps the truth is this: the myths themselves are the real phenomenon. They spread across cultures without contact. They reappear in modern accounts no matter how the details are disproved. They feed off ambiguity, growing in soil made fertile by real anomalies. The compass spinning, the strange warmth of hidden caves, the abrupt retreat of entire fleets. When people point to Hollow Earth, they are not citing geology. They are invoking a human pattern, an unshakable desire to believe the world is more than blunt matter. Whether Byrd opened a hidden doorway or not, his story becomes a vessel for that desire. Science can close the discussion on structure, but not on story. Myths are not geology. They are map markers of wonder. Their persistence makes them powerful lenses, even if they show no physical kingdoms. You don't measure them in kilometres and rock density. You measure them in resonance. And through that lens, Byrd's valley tale sharpens. It is not proof, but interpretation. It becomes one more mirror in humanity's hall of voices whispering about lands inside the earth. Hollow Earth myths are not fact, and geology stands firm against them. But they are potent interpretive frameworks. Without them, Byrd's diary sounds isolated, implausible, even absurd. With them, It sounds familiar enough that people cannot shake it loose. They make his account feel like a chapter in a global story. Myths, not physics, hold the key to why Operation Highjump's mysteries resonate so deeply. They cast imagination as continuity rather than madness, and in 1947, these myths did not exist in isolation. They collided headfirst with geopolitics. The Cold War landscape turned silence into policy, and policy into suspicion. Into this climate, stories of ancient guardians and hidden realms slipped easily, offering one more layer of meaning to a world already dizzy with secrecy. And so the myth of a world beneath our feet became one more element in a year defined by silence, suspicion, and shadows gathering at both poles of the Earth. But Antarctica is not inscribed only in legend. Even as myths of inner worlds spread through whispers and pulp, other marks were being laid down, marks not of imagination but of geopolitics. Where one kind of story was written in tales of guardians and hidden realms, another was stamped directly onto charts, a reminder that maps too can carry myths of their own, pressed not in story but in ink. The stories of inner worlds echo with myth. Agartha, Shambhala, cities beneath the crust. But myths are not the only inscriptions Antarctica carries. Some are sharper, some are written in flags and ink. Picture a map unrolled in 1939, on the eve of war. Across its white expanse, in letters too bold to ignore, appears a new name, New Schwabenland, New Swabia. A German claim stamped onto the bottom of the world. The expedition that placed it there was not whispered or legendary. It was real. A ship named Schwabenland sailed south, carrying aircraft and crews, cameras and measuring devices. Over weeks they flew reconnaissance, dropped markers, photographed coasts. They did not conquer, did not colonize, but they named, and naming carries its own permanence. Cartographers understand. A name on a map outlives the moment. Ink endures longer than intentions. Long after the war ended, long after Germany fell, the label New Schwabenland still clung to charts, as if refusing erasure. Critics argue the name was nothing more than routine territorial posturing. Supporters insist it foreshadowed deeper motives, bases carved into ice, secrets that later collided with Operation Highjump. The truth is likely less cinematic, but the shadow remains. A name once written has weight. Imagine the crew of the Schwabenland. Their ship cutting through Southern Ocean swells, aircraft launched from catapults to photograph an alien coast. They see glaciers rising like walls, black mountains pushing through ice. In their reports, they measure, map, record. Yet in their minds, they must have felt what every explorer feels, the unease of claiming land that feels unclaimable. Still, they dropped markers emblazoned with swastikas, fluttering against wind that did not care who owned it. They carved their nation's presence into emptiness, and that presence lingered, even as war consumed Europe. After 1945, when the world staggered through the ruins of conflict, the Antarctic name did not vanish. It persisted like graffiti, sprayed across a frozen wall no one could erase. For sailors steaming south in 1947, for Byrd's men peering over maps, the German label hovered like a ghost. Supporters of conspiracy suggest the US Armada sailed partly in response, to investigate, to confront, to ensure no rival stronghold had taken root in the south. Critics dismiss this as fantasy, noting the German expedition built no bases, left no lasting structures. But the presence of the name was enough. Names do not need buildings to haunt, they need only memory. Think of the human impulse to overwrite landscapes with language, to rename mountains, seas, valleys, to stamp an identity onto the indifferent. Antarctica resists, yet even here the ink was pressed, and once pressed, it bled into imagination. New Swabia became a seed for stories of hidden bases, of craft tested beneath ice, of technologies spirited away at the war's end. Most of these tales collapse under scrutiny, yet their persistence is telling. The name on the map gave them soil. A label, once planted, will grow legends whether or not the ground deserves them. You picture Byrd in his cockpit tracing a finger across a chart. Along the coast, the word Neuschwabenland. He does not speak it aloud, but he sees it. He knows it. And when he flies above valleys warm against expectation, when compasses spin and radios murmur, that label on paper cannot help but echo in his mind. Because myth and fact blur easily when both are printed in ink. In the decades after, treaties would sweep names aside, levelling claims into collective neutrality. But erasure does not erase. To those who remember, the German name remained etched, a reminder that even the most desolate continent is not immune to politics, ambition, or imagination. And this is why the story endures. Myths of inner Earths may rise and fall, but the German expedition is documented. It happened, it left a mark. And that mark bleeds into every retelling of Highjump, every rumour of hidden craft, every echo of war that refuses to die. Critics will continue to argue it was routine, mundane, insignificant. Supporters will continue to insist it was prelude, evidence, proof of something hidden. But both sides acknowledge the same unshakable fact. In 1939, a name was written on the white map, and names have gravity. And so you are left with a paradox. Antarctica resists ownership, yet it is covered in claims. It resists permanence, yet even the most fragile inscriptions echo across decades. Neuschwabenland may no longer be official, but it endures, half history, half legend. And it is in that overlap between history's hard facts and legend's soft shadows that the next whispers take shape. For if a name can linger without structures, perhaps stories can linger without proof. Stories of craft gliding from the sea, witnessed not in maps or treaties, but in startled eyes and trembling voices. Among the loudest whispers from Operation Highjump are not about weather or mapping, but about something much less expected. Disc-shaped craft said to have risen straight out of the Antarctic seas to confront the fleet. You imagine standing on a deck in the Southern Ocean, the cold air burning your face, when suddenly a gleaming object cuts the surface of the water and hovers above the waves. To later storytellers, these moments became the defining feature of the entire mission. Not a training exercise, not logistics, but a secret war in the Antarctic. Yet like most legends, what begins as a simple claim soon twists through exaggeration, decades of retelling, and layers of geopolitical tension. By the time these whispers reached wider audiences, tales of UFO battles had taken centre stage, despite scarce proof that any clash occurred. Supporters of the idea draw from accounts said to originate with survivors. These men supposedly described unfamiliar craft circling the ships, darting in rapid movements no aircraft of the 1940s could manage, and at times rising straight from beneath the ocean. The craft's apparent speed and manoeuvrability seemed unnerving, ignoring every rule of aerodynamics naval aviators had been trained to respect. These recollections circulated for years in quiet communities of veterans and enthusiasts. But as each decade passed, the stories grew stranger. They became the seeds for documentaries and speculative books, painting Operation Highjump as a hidden aerial conflict. In that interpretation, the massive US naval presence had not been for weather experiments or cartography, but for combat with forces unknown. For some, this was the explanation for the abrupt withdrawal. Not storms, not logistics, but defeat. In Cold War years, the legend found fertile soil in Soviet intelligence circles. Decades later, references appeared in KGB-related reports, suggesting Admiral Byrd's fleet had faced mysterious aerial craft. Some sources described a battle that left casualties and damaged equipment. These claims spread widely in the 1990s, when archival fragments leaked, fused with speculation, and were repeated without verification. By then, several sensational documentaries presented Operation Highjump as a UFO engagement. The worsening distortion turned an already mysterious retreat into an outright legend of war against forces unacknowledged. For audiences already primed to trust anything suppressed by governments, the narrative carried irresistible appeal. The problem is that many of these documents lacked clear attribution or suffered from translation errors. What began as anecdotes from sailors or pilots ended up amplified into myth by intelligence rivalries and later television. Critical examination of these accounts shows multiple cracks. Names of ships are listed incorrectly in many versions. Battle dates shift depending on the telling. Even the number of supposed fatalities varies wildly between sources, with some claiming minor losses and others inflating casualties into the hundreds. Naval records, by contrast, list certain accidents, but nothing like a full-scale battle at sea with unknown craft. For historians, this makes the UFO battle scenario poor evidence. It looks instead like a product of Cold War rumour, intelligence play, and later commercialisation of mystery. Yet for those who want to believe, these misreports themselves become proof. If official accounts don't match the legends, perhaps that mismatch signals cover-up. And so the contradictions feed the cycle of suspicion rather than resolve it. It's important to trace how myth-making attaches itself to real blanks in narrative. Operation Highjump genuinely did end early. It really did carry a fleet oddly large for scientific goals. Crew members really did describe unusual atmospheric anomalies that confused instruments. Against these facts, the absence of a detailed explanation for the withdrawal created space for imagination to expand. Stories of flying discs fit neatly into that silence. Eyewitness recollections, however vague, were enough to suggest that something out of place had happened. Over time, suggestive moments hardened into concrete claims, and claims hardened into elaborate battles told with conviction despite the lack of physical proof. It shows how easily history and speculation can merge whenever curiosity meets silence. At this point you might ask whether such stories had any echo beyond America's naval personnel, and this is where South America comes into view again. Throughout the 1940s, newspapers in Chile and Argentina occasionally ran reports of mysterious objects moving across their skies. Witnesses described luminous craft performing maneuvers beyond known aviation. These reports, while not unique to South America, carried added resonance because of the continent's proximity to Antarctica. When those same nations observed the sudden early end of Operation Highjump, they connected the two streams of rumour. If unidentified craft had been seen in their own skies, perhaps Byrd had seen them down south as well. The press amplified this speculation, and once again official US silence only gave those connections more credibility in the public imagination. For readers in Santiago or Buenos Aires, the mystery around Byrd matched something they themselves had glimpsed. Even as credible scholarship points out the flaws, misreported ship names, missing physical evidence, reliance on accounts retold decades after the fact, the eyewitness anecdotes don't disappear. Instead, they linger. A sailor confesses that he once saw something rise from the water. A pilot shakes his head, saying instruments failed just as a gleam darted across the horizon. Each memory, no matter how small, becomes fuel for others who want to weave the narrative into something cohesive. And because humans place more weight on direct testimony than on abstract data, these fragments hold surprising staying power. Scholars can point to the geological impossibility of Hollow Earth, or to the naval record showing no such engagement. Still, the voice of one man saying "I saw something" outweighs reams of charts for those predisposed to believe. Notice the rhythm here. Fact creates gaps, and gaps attract embellishment. The larger the gap, the larger the myth attached to it. With Operation Highjump, specific details about aircraft losses, weather complications, and logistical challenges were never fully elaborated for the public. Into that silence rushed tales of discs. Some frame them as German craft escaping into Antarctic refugees after the war. Others described them as alien vessels rising from inner oceans. Still others linked them to ancient legends of guardians beneath the ice. The common feature was not the source, but the need to explain what remained unexplained. The story became a mirror reflecting whatever each teller needed: Nazis, aliens, spirits, or advanced civilizations. But whatever the content, the form was the same. Craft rising from Antarctic waters to challenge the most formidable navy afloat at the time. So where does that leave us? If you sit with naval records, accident logs, and mission debriefs, you find no confirmation of combat, or even consistent mention of unknown aerial objects. If you wander into the archive of conspiracy, you find a thriving body of claims, each less precise than the next. Between them lies a gulf. The official record looks too clean, the alternative accounts too messy, and in that gulf is where myth grows best. Whether or not UFOs hovered over Antarctica is a question we cannot answer. But what is true is that people believed enough to retell the story across continents. The legend of discs rising from cold waters became part of the way Operation Highjump is remembered. This is the mini payoff. What these stories reveal is not proof of aerial battles, but proof of how swiftly blank spots become filled with myth. The mere absence of explanation invites entire universes of possibility. Did sailors truly see discs? Did pilots encounter craft that left no trace? Or did human imagination, backed by the perfect storm of secrecy and Cold War fear, supply what official channels withheld? We may never know, but the myth is as instructive as the fact. It shows us how humans resist empty spaces in history. Silence opens doors, and silence is exactly what Highjump handed to the world. That door is still open, and the story of rising craft continues to fly through it. Whether the UFOs existed or not, one thing is certain: the continent that bred these tales has since been shielded from prying eyes, because a decade after Operation Highjump's return, Antarctica itself would become governed by an international treaty, a treaty that to this day limits both military activity and open exploration of its most remote hidden corners. Which means if secrets do linger beneath the ice, discovery is no longer in the hands of fleets or intrepid explorers. It lies behind treaty signatures, oversight committees, and walls of restriction. And that silence has only deepened the mystery. The sailors swore they saw craft glide from the sea. Some told their stories quietly, others never told them at all. Those rumours became the loudest echo of Operation Highjump, circling for years like a shadow that would not dissipate. But the story of Admiral Byrd does not end there, in 1947, with silence and suspicion. It stretches onward into another decade, into another mission, into a return to the ice. The mission was called Operation Deep Freeze. The echoes of Highjump never faded. They lingered in headlines, in whispers, in the uneasy silence of official reports. So when the Navy returned less than a decade later, it was not stepping onto a blank stage. It was returning to ground already heavy with rumour. Deep Freeze carried the language of science and logistics, but behind it trailed the memory of spinning compasses, missing reels, and stories of craft rising from the sea. The ice had not forgotten, and neither had the world watching from above the equator. The year is 1955. The world has changed. The Cold War is no longer a whisper but a drumbeat. Jets scream over new skies, hydrogen bombs rattle deserts, and nations measure power not only in armies but in the size of their shadows. Into this climate, the United States announces another great Antarctic undertaking. Not a hurried expedition this time, but a permanent presence. Stations to be built, airfields carved, supply lines established, and at the centre of it, once again, is Admiral Byrd. Older now, but still the face of America's southern ambitions. The scale of Deep Freeze dwarfs Highjump. Icebreakers smash channels through frozen seas. Cargo planes thunder overhead, heavier and more modern than the R4D5Ls Byrd once trusted. Men unload timber, steel, radio towers. Bulldozers crawl onto the ice like iron insects. carving foundations into a continent that never welcomed permanence. This is no fleeting armada, it is settlement. The South Pole itself becomes the target, a place no human had stood since Amundsen and Scott. In 1956, an American plane lands there. The white silence of centuries is broken by engines, footsteps, laughter, the click of cameras. And Byrd is there, not in the cockpit this time, but as commander, watching the dream of permanence unfold. Supporters of the high jump mysteries often wonder why return so massively, so publicly, after the rumours of 1947. Critics say the answer is simple: science, strategy, prestige. The International Geophysical Year of 1957 loomed, and nations raced to plant flags not for conquest but for data. But to those who look with suspicion, deep freeze feels like continuation, as though high jump had left questions unanswered, and a decade later, those questions demanded attention. Imagine Byrd standing at the edge of a runway scraped onto ice, the horizon stretching endlessly, but this time dotted with radio towers, barracks, and lights that glow against the Antarctic night. He once flew over emptiness, now he oversees encampments. He once returned home with rumours, now he returns with photographs of stations bristling with antennas. For some, this was reassurance, proof that nothing extraordinary lurked beneath the ice, that Antarctica could be tamed into outposts like any other land. For others, it was the opposite, confirmation that the continent mattered too much to be left alone. There is a human element in this return that feels poignant. Byrd was no longer the daring young aviator who had first flown over the pole in 1926. He was older, weary, his career shadowed by both triumph and secrecy. To see him step again onto Antarctic ice, flanked by cameras and officials, is to see a man circling back to the place that had defined him, haunted him, and perhaps silenced him. Some accounts describe him giving speeches about peace, about science, about cooperation. Others note his caution, his phrasing measured, his eyes heavy. Supporters claim he still carried secrets, that his return was less about discovery and more about vigilance. Ensuring the door left ajar in 1947 was not left unguarded. Operation Deep Freeze built the infrastructure that still endures. McMurdo Station, the South Pole Base, and others rose during these years. They became the footholds that would later allow the Antarctic Treaty to exist. Without them, there would have been no framework to lock the continent into neutrality. And yet, look closely at photographs of those first stations. Wood shacks swallowed by snowdrifts, towers rimmed with frost, vehicles half buried in storms. The continent consumed permanence as easily as it consumed rumour. The bases seemed fragile, impermanent, already vanishing even as they were built. Supporters of the myth sometimes describe Deep Freeze as a second attempt, a way to reassert control after High Jump's abrupt withdrawal. Critics dismiss this, pointing out that the missions had different goals, different scales, different contexts, but the juxtaposition remains compelling. High Jump ended early, wrapped in whispers. Deep Freeze began openly, wrapped in fanfare. One mission collapsed into rumour, the other built the scaffolding of global treaties, and in both, Admiral Byrd stands at the centre, a figure bridging legend and fact. There is a metaphor in his arc. High Jump was the closed door, Deep Freeze the reopened one. High Jump left absence. Deep Freeze insisted on presence. High Jump left rumours of encounters. Deep Freeze left radio towers and supply depots, and yet both fed the same mystery. Why did Antarctica matter so much so suddenly in those years? Because by 1959, just 3 years after the first planes landed at the pole, the Antarctic Treaty was signed. A treaty that froze territorial claims, banned military presence, and locked away mineral rights. In less than a decade, the continent had shifted from contested void to shared silence. You're left with an image. Byrd, wrapped in a parka, standing on Antarctic ice for the last time. Around him, machines roar, men hammer, cameras flash. The land he once crossed in fragile plains now bristles with permanence. Yet his gaze is not on the stations, not on the towers. It is on the horizon. The same horizon he watched in 1947, when the compass spun, when the radio hissed, when the ice whispered. Perhaps he saw nothing more than snow. Perhaps he saw memory. Perhaps he saw something he could never speak. The stations rose, the treaty followed, and the door that had been forced open by deep freeze was quietly locked again. Not with padlocks or chains, but with pens scratching signatures on paper, turning the most desolate continent into the most guarded. And once more, Antarctica settled back into hush, not empty, but withheld. After Highjump, Antarctica did not remain a blank space for long. Within a decade, the continent was wrapped in agreements so strict you can almost hear the locks clicking shut. The Antarctic Treaty System arrived in 1959, and with it came a new set of rules. No new claims of sovereignty, no military outposts, no war games, and supposedly nothing but research and international cooperation. On paper, it looked like humanity taking a higher road, agreeing to preserve an entire landmass for science and peace alone. But to anyone aware of Byrd's mission, and the whispers that lingered after it, the timing raised another question entirely. If there were secrets to be kept, this was the kind of governance that could keep them contained forever. The treaty was ambitious. 12 nations signed it early. Countries like the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and others who had the reach to operate in those icy extremes. Its articles banned the use of Antarctica for military purposes, prohibited nuclear testing, and outlawed the disposal of radioactive waste. Instead, the treaty declared that the continent should be used only for peaceful purposes. Scientific research was prioritized, and results were to be freely shared. The words make Antarctica sound like a neutral sanctuary, a frozen commons for humankind. The reality, though, is that access became tightly regulated. You could not simply wander south with your own agenda. Access required approval, coordination, and oversight. Oversight did not stop there. In the decades that followed, the regime expanded. The Madrid Protocol of 1991 deepened the restrictions, designating Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. It placed major limits on resource activity, forbidding mining or exploitation despite Antarctica's untapped reserves of coal, oil, and possible rare minerals. By international agreement, those resources were left untouched. Once more, the stated logic was noble: preserve a continent for research, not profit. But step back for a moment and weigh what that means. In an era when nations fought over every fragment of territory and resource, here was a land larger than Europe sealed against claims. Not forever, but for periods that effectively pushed questions of sovereignty into permanent suspension. On the surface, this reflects rare global cooperation. During a Cold War that divided the world, adversaries agreed to lay down arms in Antarctica. They agreed to inspections, shared scientific bases, and limited rivalry. In official language, it reads like a story of sanity prevailing during tense years. Yet the very neatness of this arrangement is what continues to stir suspicion. If resources existed, oil below ice, minerals in the mountains, why voluntarily postpone exploitation? If military advantage could be claimed, strategic bases at the far south, why prohibit them? Those inclined toward legend ask whether the prohibition served another purpose, not protection of wildlife, but concealment of discoveries nations decided were better left sealed away. Think of it from another angle. With the treaty in place, Antarctica became one of the most carefully managed and monitored regions on Earth. Every expedition requires coordination. Every scientific team needs permission. Civilian settlement is essentially impossible. Technically, adventurous tourists can board tightly controlled cruises that hug the fringes of the continent, but no one lives freely inside. Compare this with the rest of the world, where deserts, mountains, and jungles are crossed without global restriction. Only Antarctica is subjected to this degree of oversight, locked under rules agreed by superpowers and rivals alike. To conspiracy theorists, this is the ultimate coincidence. If Admiral Byrd experienced anomalies, if strange encounters occurred in 1947, the treaty became the tool to ensure the world would never stumble upon them again. The ban on military activity is especially notable. It forbids fortifications, manoeuvres and weapons testing. No other continent has been cordoned off from force in such absolute terms. Even the Arctic remains militarised, with submarines shuttling below the ice and aircraft carriers passing through. Antarctica alone is declared untouchable. It sounds idealistic, but it also ensures that the kind of massive fleet Byrd commanded would not reappear there. Even if a navy wanted to undertake another high-jump scale operation, international law would label it unlawful. Science is welcome, armadas are not. For some, that is proof of peace. For others, it is the evidence of a gate deliberately locked. The Madrid Protocol amplified this suspicion. Its environmental rules are strict but sweeping. Mining of mineral resources is banned indefinitely. Exploration for oil or gas is prohibited. Even activities with potential ecological risk are scrutinised. The framing is nature conservation. But if you believe the deeper myths, the conservation language is a mask. Mining would risk uncovering more than rocks. Drilling might break into warm lakes, caves, or environments best kept unknown. The restriction on industrial activity ensures nothing penetrates too far below. And in a story where Byrd wrote of hidden valleys and beings, that ban appears less like environmentalism and more like insurance. Now add the human detail. No permanent population inhabits Antarctica. A handful of research stations operate, many run by militaries rebranded as scientific units. But they are temporary. Crews rotate. Numbers remain small. No one plants a town. No one raises generations there. The Antarctic Treaty created a continent without citizens, without voters, without independent voices of its own. Ask yourself, what continent in history has existed without the testimony of its inhabitants? Only this one, only Antarctica. Which means control rests entirely in the hands of governments and research institutions. For those inclined to suspect concealment, this becomes all the evidence they need. Echoes of suspicion arise again in the cultural conversation. The public asks, why keep civilians and private explorers out? Why did superpowers cooperate here, when everywhere else they fought? If secrecy surrounded Byrd's mission, treaties offered a system to preserve that secrecy indefinitely. From this angle, the Antarctic Treaty is interpreted less as a triumph of international harmony and more as a collaborative coverlid. Rumours attach directly to this vacuum. If luminous beings exist beneath the ice, treaties prevent outsiders from reaching them. If craft once rose from the water, treaties protect their territory. Whether plausible or not, the system of lockdown oversight feeds the same story. Of course, treaties also achieve actual stability. Without them, rival claimants might have fought over Antarctic coasts, carved the land with bases, and damaged fragile ecosystems. The Antarctic Treaty prevented colonial clashes during some of the darkest years of the Cold War. In this sense, it delivered what it promised: structure and peace. Scientists gained a continent to study climate, geology and biology without interference. Records improved. Cooperative projects took shape. The reason this achievement is sometimes framed with suspicion is because peace itself is unusual. People expect rivalries. They expect exploitation. When those do not occur, speculation fills the gap. Suddenly structure looks like secrecy. Suddenly order looks like concealment. This tension is the heart of the matter. On one side, treaties provide rules, oversight, protections and guarantees. On the other, they look like carefully closed doors. To historians, they are pragmatic responses to Cold War risk. To conspiracy thinkers, they are instruments of censorship disguised as environmental law. The truth probably lies closer to diplomacy than to hidden civilizations. But once a story has found fertile ground, ordinary explanations rarely kill it. Instead, myths thrive beside treaties, borrowing their discipline and reframing it as evidence of control. The rules designed to keep the peace have become symbols of exclusion, doors locked against ordinary eyes. The Antarctic Treaty System created a rare zone of stability, ensuring the continent could not be militarized or divided. Yet in a world where silence and anomalies already haunted Byrd's expedition, the treaty appears as an extension of that silence. Instead of opening Antarctica to understanding, it placed gates over every path inward. True or not, the optics suggest hidden reasons. A locked door is always an invitation to wonder what lies behind it. And Antarctica's doors are not only locked, but sealed with international signatures, which leaves us with the question hanging: if Admiral Byrd witnessed something extraordinary under the ice, did governments agree it was best kept hidden? Was the treaty a diplomatic miracle or a convenient vault? Either interpretation fits the record, but one answer unsettles more than the other. Because if Byrd was not just an explorer, but a messenger, then perhaps what he carried back was not a secret too fragile for his own time, but something governments decided the world could never be ready to hear. And if that is so, the gates of Antarctica remain closed not only to protect a continent, but to shield the story of what may still lie beneath it. The ink was barely dry on the Antarctic Treaty when the continent reminded everyone that it didn't need human law to generate mysteries. It had always made its own. Not hidden in diaries or missing reels this time, but painted directly into the sky. You picture yourself standing on the deck of a ship locked in pack ice. The air is razor thin, the horizon unbroken. Then suddenly it shifts. Mountains appear where none exist. A coastline shimmers in the distance, cliffs and valleys etched in perfect detail. You blink, and they vanish. The horizon returns to emptiness. This is not imagination. It is Fata Morgana, a polar mirage. Light bending through layers of cold air, stretching and duplicating landscapes, raising the impossible into view. Antarctica does this constantly, like a painter obsessed with trickery. Sailors called them looming islands. Sometimes they saw ships rising high above the water, inverted, upside down, gliding across the sky. Sometimes entire cities bloomed in the distance, towers glowing with impossible light. The men knew they were illusions, yet knowing didn't dissolve their unease, because illusions can feel more real than what stands in front of you. And in Antarctica, illusions are magnified. The ice itself seems to conspire with the atmosphere, carving light into structures. Glaciers stretch into cathedrals. A single ridge becomes a fortress. A thin band of cloud blossoms into the skyline of a forgotten world. Critics remind us that these mirages are natural, explainable, predictable even. Supporters counter that explanation does not lessen their impact. If a sailor sees a city rising from the horizon and vanishing moments later, his memory will not shrink to optical effect. It will swell into story. And this is the key. Antarctica does not just distort radio waves or spin compasses. It distorts sight itself. It makes you question the boundary between real and imagined, between fact and perception. If you're told not to trust diaries, not to trust rumours, not to trust reels, what do you do when your own eyes join the deception? Imagine Byrd's men on a flight over the ice. The cockpit glass glows with sunlight. The horizon smears into haze. Then, in the distance, peaks rise. They look sharp, precise, unmistakable. A valley spreads, green against the glare. The plane dips, cameras click. Later, when the film is developed, the peaks are gone, the valley erased. The men wonder if they imagined it, but they did not. They saw a mirage as vivid as stone. The problem is not belief. The problem is memory. How do you separate what you witnessed from what never was? There are stories, unconfirmed but persistent, of crews reporting entire fleets seen on the horizon, gleaming hulls drifting in air, only to fade as the planes drew closer. Others told of castles rising from the ice, shimmering towers of glass, gone before they reached them. Each story bends the line between optical trick and legend. Each story adds to the sense that Antarctica is not just a continent, but a stage where light itself plays an actor. The beauty of these illusions lies in their cruelty. They give you a glimpse of something extraordinary and then take it away. They leave you with memory but no evidence. They remind you of the fragility of sight and the power of longing. And in that longing, myth finds its foothold. Critics say this is precisely how legends grow. Misperceptions, atmospheric tricks, nothing more. Supporters reply that legends don't need more. They only need a witness who felt what he saw was real. You stand again on the ice, watching the horizon shift. For a moment you see a city, spires, arches, streets. You want to run toward it, to find proof, but it dissolves. The city was only light refracted through cold, and yet you carry it inside you as if you had walked its streets. This is the secret Antarctica keeps best. Not that it hides truth, but that it manufactures experiences that feel like truth. Mirages become memories. Memories become myths. Myths become history, whispered in shadows. Operation Highjump, Operation Deep Freeze, treaties, diaries, reels, all these are human layers of secrecy. But the continent itself has its own methods. It hides, it distorts, it invents. Even without governments, Antarctica would still make mysteries. And so, after the treaties locked the land, the sky continued to unlock imaginations. No pen could prevent the light from bending. No signature could erase the shimmer of a phantom mountain. You're left with a final paradox. The land most bound by rules is also the land most free to deceive. Antarctica will always offer you something extraordinary, then take it back. It will always give you a vision, and then strip it bare. And when that happens, you are left with the same lingering unease Byrd carried, the same unease his men whispered about, the same unease every explorer feels. If the horizon itself lies, what else lies with it? The treaty sealed the land, the mirages sealed the mind. Both remind you that Antarctica is not empty, it is withholding. And so the final question persists, heavy as ice and light as air. Not whether Admiral Byrd told the truth, but whether the truth itself is designed never to stay still. If Admiral Byrd truly saw hidden valleys and beings beneath the ice, maybe the reason we never learned more is that the cost of revealing it was too high for 1947. A world fresh from war, staring at nuclear weapons, could barely handle the fear it already carried. History might not have been rewritten to deceive us, but to protect a fragile balance. The silence became the safer choice, and so the question lingers like a ghost over Antarctica. The ice holds its hush, but perhaps the gate still waits beneath it, quiet, patient, and sealed in white.